I had $27 million waiting for me at the end of a 15-minute drive. The papers were ready. The lawyers were waiting. All I had to do was sign my name. But at a red light on Fifth Avenue, a homeless man stepped out of the rain, filthy, broken, barely standing, and pressed his cracked lips close to my car window, and he whispered my name. Not my public name, not Rowan Mercer, my real name. The one only my dead mother ever called me. I never made it to that law office. What happened next destroyed everything I thought I knew about my family, my money, and the woman who raised me. Stay until the end. Drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The morning I was supposed to become a millionaire, I burned my toast. I know that sounds ridiculous. $27 million sitting in a law firm downtown, my name on every document, my signature the only thing standing between me and a complete reversal of fortune. And the thing I remember most clearly from that morning is the smell of scorched bread and the way the smoke alarm in my apartment kept screaming until I threw a dish towel over it. That's the thing nobody tells you about life-changing days. They don't feel like anything special when they start. They feel like Tuesdays. It was a Tuesday. October 14th, Seattle in full autumn collapse. Wet leaves plastered to the sidewalks, the sky the color of old pewter, rain so fine and persistent, it was more like the air itself had decided to be water. I'd lived in this city for 11 years and I still hadn't made peace with the October rain. My mother used to say Seattle rain was the kind that got into your bones and set up a permanent address. My mother. She'd been gone for 6 years, and somehow, on the morning I was supposed to collect what remained of her family's fortune, I couldn't stop thinking about her standing at the kitchen window of our old apartment in Tacoma, watching rain streak down the glass, telling me things I was too young and too stupid to really hear. I shook it off, scraped the burned toast into the sink, drank my coffee standing over it because I didn't have time to sit. The appointment was at 10 o'clock sharp at Callaway, Hendricks & Fitch, a law firm so old and so expensive that their lobby probably charged admission. I'd never set foot inside, never had reason to. 3 weeks ago, I'd never heard of them. Then their senior partner, a man named Gerald Fitch, had shown up at my office with a manila folder and a look on his face like he was delivering news from another century, which, in a way, he was. Ma'am, Mr. Mercer, he'd said, settling into the chair across from my desk with the careful movements of a man who spent a lot of time delivering information that rearranged people's lives. Are you aware that your maternal grandfather, a Mr. Harold Ashford Wren, passed away 6 weeks ago in Spokane? I stared at him. I don't have a maternal grandfather, I said. My mother was an only child of parents who died before I was born. That's what she told me. Gerald Fitch opened his manila folder. I'm afraid, he said, in a tone that suggested he was not particularly afraid at all. That's not entirely accurate. What followed was 45 minutes of information that rewired my understanding of my own history. Harold Ashford Wren had been alive my entire life. He was 81 years old when he died of cardiac failure in a private residence outside Spokane. He had been, by any measurable standard, extraordinarily wealthy, the kind of wealth that doesn't announce itself but simply exists, like weather. He had accumulated his fortune over 50 years through a holding company called Wren Capital Group, which had its fingers in real estate, private equity, and what Fitch carefully described as legacy investment portfolios. He had known about me since the day I was born. He had chosen, for reasons Fitch said he was not at liberty to fully disclose, to remain absent from my life. And now he was dead, and his estate, after legal fees, after taxes, after the dissolution of certain business arrangements, amounted to $27,400,000, left entirely to me. I sat in my office chair and felt absolutely nothing for a long moment. Then I felt something that wasn't happiness or gratitude or excitement. It was closer to anger, the particular anger of someone who has been lied to so thoroughly and for so long that the truth, when it finally arrives, doesn't feel like relief. It feels like a door being opened to reveal another locked door behind it. Why? I asked Fitch. I beg your pardon? Why me? Why now? Why didn't he ever... I stopped, restarted. He knew about me my entire life and never once reached out. Not when my mother died. Not when I was 23 and broke and sleeping on a friend's couch. Nothing. And now he's dead and suddenly I'm the heir? Why? Gerald Fitch closed his folder with the practiced composure of a man who had answered this particular category of question many times before. Mr. Wren's motivations were his own, he said. What I can tell you is that his final instructions were explicit and unambiguous. You are the sole beneficiary. The estate is yours. All that's required is your signature on the transfer documents. He paused. October 14th, 10 a.m., our office is on Fifth Avenue. He handed me a card. I'd encourage you not to be late, he said. There are time-sensitive elements to the estate. I looked at the card for a long time after he left. Time-sensitive elements. I should have asked what that meant. I didn't. 3 weeks later, I was in my car. A 2019 Subaru Outback with a cracked dashboard and a heating system that worked at about 60% efficiency. Not exactly the vehicle of a man about to inherit a fortune, but I'd never been the type to perform wealth I didn't have. I was a software architect. I drove a practical car. I wore practical clothes. I had a one-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill that I'd been meaning to repaint for 2 years. In 40 minutes, theoretically, none of that would be permanent anymore. I drove through the rain with NPR murmuring in the background and tried to feel something appropriate for the occasion. Excitement, maybe. Or at least some kind of readiness. Instead, I kept circling back to the same question I'd been circling for 3 weeks. Why didn't she tell me? My mother, Claire Mercer, Claire Wren before she took her married name from a man who disappeared before I was 2, had spent my entire childhood constructing a family history built on absence. No grandparents, no extended family, no roots, just the two of us and the story she told, that she'd come from nothing and together we'd make something. I loved her for that story. I built myself on it. And apparently it was a lie. Not the love. I don't think the love was a lie. But the absence was manufactured. The isolation was chosen. My grandfather existed and breathed and accumulated $27 million for 81 years while I grew up 300 miles away not knowing he existed. Why? What could possibly... The light ahead turned red. I stopped beneath the overpass at 5th and Clement, windshield wipers pushing rain aside in their rhythmic and different way, and I looked out the side window the way you do when you're not really looking at anything, just letting your eyes rest somewhere that isn't the inside of your own skull. That's when I saw him. He was standing on the sidewalk maybe 15 feet from the passenger side of my car. Not panhandling. No sign. No cup. No outstretched hand. Just standing in the rain like he'd grown there. He was somewhere in his 60s, I thought, though the kind of life that put him on that street had a way of adding decades to a face. Gray stubble that was growing toward a beard. A coat that had once been green and had faded to something closer to the color of dead leaves. His hands were hanging at his sides, and he was looking at the cars the way people look when they've stopped expecting anything from them. I looked away. The light was going to change in 30 seconds. I had an appointment. I looked back at him. I don't know why. Some peripheral pull. He was already looking at me. Not at my car. At me, through the rain-blurred window, with an intensity that was uncomfortable, in the specific way that eye contact with strangers is uncomfortable when it lasts 1 second longer than the social contract allows. Then he walked toward the car. My hand moved automatically toward the door lock. An instinct. I'm not proud of it, but I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen. He stopped right at the passenger window. The rain was running off his coat in small rivers. Up close, I could see his eyes were dark. Not brown, something closer to gray, and they were very, very awake. Alert in a way that didn't match the rest of him. He didn't knock on the glass. He didn't gesture for me to roll the window down. He just leaned slightly forward, and he said something, and even through the glass and the rain and the engine idling and NPR talking about municipal budget shortfalls, I heard it. 2 syllables. Barely a sound. Rowdy. I stopped breathing. That was the name my mother called me. Not Rowan. Rowdy. A private nickname from before I could remember. From some incident in my infancy that she always refused to fully explain, but would describe with a laugh as the day I understood I was outnumbered. She'd used it my entire childhood. She'd used it in her last coherent words to me from a hospital bed. Nobody had called me that in 6 years. Nobody outside of this man could possibly have known it existed. The light turned green. The car behind me honked. I didn't move. I rolled down the window. The rain came in immediately, spattering the center console and my left sleeve. "What did you say?" My voice came out stranger than I intended, quieter. The man's expression didn't change. He wasn't scared of me. He wasn't performing anything. He just looked at me with those gray awake eyes and said, again, "Rowdy, that's what she called you. Who are you?" "Someone who knew your mother." A pause. Every word came out like he was measuring the weight of it before releasing it. "Someone who should have found you sooner. I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry about a lot of things." The car behind me honked again, a longer, more aggressive blast. I ignored it. I was staring at this man, his cracked knuckles, the way his collar was wet through, the absolute stillness in his face, trying to calculate whether I was having some kind of stress-induced hallucination on my way to collect an inheritance I hadn't known existed a month ago. "Get in," I heard myself say. He blinked. Just once. A micro-expression of something that might have been relief. "You sure?" he said. "No," I said. "Get in anyway." His name was Elias Voss. He told me this while I pulled the car off Fifth Avenue into a loading zone outside a Vietnamese restaurant that wasn't open yet. He sat in my passenger seat with his hands on his knees and dripped rainwater onto my floor mat and seemed completely untroubled by the fact that I was studying him the way you study something you can't quite identify. "Elias Voss," I repeated. "That's right. And you knew my mother." "Yes." "How?" He looked out the windshield for a moment. The rain was picking up. People on the sidewalk were pulling collars up and moving faster, the specific choreography of getting caught in weather you didn't prepare for. "We worked at the same company," he said, "a long time ago. She was in their financial audit division. I was a forensic accountant, independent contractor." His voice was flat, careful, the voice of someone who has told a story so many times internally that the emotion has been worn smooth off the surface. "We became friends, close friends, the kind that—" He stopped, started again. "She was a good person, your mother, the best person in that building by a significant margin, which made what happened to her worse." Something cold moved through my chest. "What company?" I said. He turned and looked at me directly. "Wren Capital Group." The silence in the car was absolute for a full 5 seconds. "My grandfather's company," I said. "Yes." "She worked for my grandfather's company." "She did. And she told me her parents were dead. She told me her whole family was gone." Elias Voss looked at me without flinching. "Your mother told you that because she was protecting you," he said, "and because she was terrified. And because the man who ran that company, your grandfather, Harold Wren, was not the kind of person who allowed inconvenient people to exist comfortably in his orbit." He paused. "Claire tried to leave that world behind and take you with her. I think she succeeded, mostly. I think she kept you safe." He looked at his own hands. "She didn't manage to keep herself safe." I felt the anger before I fully processed the words. A hot, blunt thing that climbed up from somewhere below rational thought. "What do you mean she didn't—" "She died of an aneurysm. At 52. That's what the death certificate said. That's what the hospital said." Elias didn't answer immediately. "Mr. Voss." "I know what the death certificate said," he told me quietly. "I also know that 18 months before she died, your mother filed an internal report with the Wren Capital Compliance Office documenting systematic fraud across 3 of the company's major investment portfolios. Evidence she'd been compiling for 2 years. She brought it to the board. She named names." My mouth was dry. "And then?" I said, though part of me already didn't want to know. "And then the report disappeared. And then her professional credentials were challenged in a formal review process that she had never been given advance notice of. And then 3 of the company's legal partners sent letters to every financial institution in the Pacific Northwest suggesting she had falsified client records." His voice was absolutely level, factual. The way someone speaks when they have lived with a fact long enough that it has become load-bearing architecture in their life. She lost her license. She lost her reputation. She spent the last year of her life fighting to clear her name. She never told me any of this, I said. My voice was someone else's voice, distant and thin. She wouldn't have. She was protecting you. His eyes were steady on me. She didn't want you anywhere near Harold Wren or the people around him. I think she believed if she fought it quietly and alone, she could keep you insulated. She was wrong about that. She was wrong about being able to fight it alone. He stopped. Something moved across his face that he controlled quickly, a flash of old grief. I tried to help her. I gave her documents. I tried to corroborate her evidence. It wasn't enough. After she died, I kept going. I kept collecting. 20 years ago, I said. 20 years ago, he confirmed. You've been living like... I gestured vaguely at all of him, the wet coat, the gaunt face, the general evidence of a life stripped down to almost nothing. For 20 years. They discredited me the same way they discredited her, he said. I expected it. I had made backup plans. What I hadn't expected was how effective they'd be at cutting off every legitimate avenue. I lost my certifications. I lost my contracts. I lost... He stopped again. Something heavier behind that pause. I had a family, a wife, 2 daughters. The pressure they applied, the legal harassment, the manufactured accusations. My wife couldn't maintain the life they made for her, and also maintain the marriage. I don't blame her. She made a reasonable choice. I sat with that for a moment. You gave up everything, I said. I gave up everything that they took. There's a difference. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat. The gesture was slow and deliberate, like he was being careful not to startle me, and withdrew something. A flash drive. Black plastic, older model. The kind that had been state-of-the-art maybe 15 years ago. Wrapped in a photograph, held in place by a rubber band that left a faded groove in the image. He held it out to me. Don't take it yet, he said immediately, as I reached for it. Let me show you the photograph first, because I need you to understand what you're holding before you decide what to do with it. He slipped the rubber band off and unfolded the photograph without removing the drive from his hand. I looked at it. My mother. Young. I had to recalibrate twice before I was sure, because she was younger than I'd ever seen her, maybe mid-20s, wearing a blazer that dated the image firmly in the early 90s. She was smiling the specific smile she saved for photographs she didn't know were being taken. Slightly turned away, the natural one, the one I'd spent 6 years forgetting I missed. Beside her, one arm half raised in a gesture that had been interrupted by the shutter, was a much younger Elias Voss. Dark-haired, clean-shaved, wearing a suit that fit. The background was a corporate lobby, modern, expensive, the particular aesthetic of money that doesn't need to advertise. At the bottom of the image, in white text that had gone slightly yellow with age, Wren Capital Group, Winter Reception, 1993. That photograph was taken 3 months before she filed her report, Elias said. I wanted you to see that she was happy at that point. She still believed it could be handled through the right channels. She still believed the institution would do the right thing when presented with evidence. He refolded it carefully around the drive. She was wrong. And you now need to decide whether you're going to make the same mistake she made. What do you mean? The appointment you have this morning, Elias said, looking at me directly. 10 a.m. Callaway, Hendricks, and Fitch. Every hair on the back of my neck stood up. How do you know about that? Because I've been watching you since Harold Wren died, he said. Because I knew they would come for you. Because Gerald Fitch is not just a probate attorney handling a routine estate. He's been on Wren Capital's legal payroll for 30 years. And because the documents they want you to sign tomorrow morning are not simply an inheritance transfer. Then what are they? Elias looked at me very carefully, the way you look at someone before you say something that will permanently change their understanding of a situation. There are assets buried in Harold Wren's estate that were never meant to be found, he said. Shell accounts, holding structures built specifically to conceal the fraud your mother documented. Harold, your grandfather, spent the last 6 years of his life very quietly compiling the same evidence your mother compiled. He was an old man who'd watched what they did to his daughter and spent decades living with it. A pause. I believe he wanted to make it right before he died. I believe he left it for you deliberately, not just the money, the evidence. The rain was very loud on the roof of the car. The flash drive, I said, is a copy of what I have. Your grandfather sent me the originals 18 months ago through a series of intermediaries. He knew who I was. He'd known for years. He waited until he was dying. There was something complicated in Elias's voice when he said this. Not quite anger, not quite grief. The people at Wren Capital think that evidence died with him. They don't know about me. They don't know about what he sent. He looked down at the photograph. But they know about you, and the documents Fitch wants you to sign include legal language that would permanently and irrevocably transfer control of those hidden assets to a trust structure managed by the company's current board. Meaning if you sign, Elias said, the evidence goes with it, into a legal structure they own completely, where it will be buried for another generation. He looked up. And you'll walk out of that office with $27 million and a clean conscience and no idea what you signed away. I looked at the flash drive in his hand. What's on it? I said. Everything, he said simply. Financial records spanning 40 years, recorded conversations, forged regulatory filings, the names of every person who signed off on what they did to your mother. A beat. And documentation of approximately $340 million in investor funds that were quietly redirected into private accounts belonging to the current board members, individual investors, pension funds, small businesses, people who trusted this company with their futures and got nothing back. I heard that number. $340 million. Not Harold Wren's fortune, not my inheritance. Money that belonged to other people, real people, retired people. People who might be sitting right now in houses they were about to lose, in lives that had been quietly hollowed out by decisions made in glass towers by men in expensive suits. Why me? I said. My voice was quieter than I intended. Why does it have to be me who does something about this? Elias looked at me, and for the first time his expression shifted, not dramatically, not theatrically, just a small, exhausted opening. Because you're all that's left, he said. Your mother is gone. I have nothing left to lose and no credibility left to spend. Harold Wren spent 80 years building an empire and died having done almost nothing with his wealth that he was proud of, and the one thing he managed to do at the very end was leave a trail for his grandson. A pause. And because this evidence means nothing if it never reaches the people who can act on it. I can't deliver it. I've tried. No regulatory body, no journalist, no federal agency will take a meeting with a homeless man with a flash drive and a 20-year-old story. But they'd take one with me. You're about to inherit $27 million from a man connected to this fraud. You are, whether you want to be or not, a material witness to the estate. A relevant party. He held the drive out again. Yes, they'd take a meeting with you. I looked at the drive. I looked at my mother's young face in the photograph. I thought about the apartment in Tacoma, the kitchen window, the rain she described getting into your bones and setting up a permanent address. She never told me about any of this, I said quietly, almost to myself. She carried all of it alone. That's who she was, Elias said, gently. She would have carried mountains alone if she thought it kept you lighter. I sat with that for a long time. The rain drummed on the roof. A delivery truck passed, close enough to rock the car slightly on its wheels. My phone buzzed on the center console. I looked at the screen. Calloway, Hendricks, and Fitch. Fitch, Gerald. Calling, checking on me, making sure I was on my way. I looked at it until it stopped buzzing. Then I looked at Elias Voss, this wrecked, patient, stubborn man who had spent 20 years in the rain holding on to something that should have burned him up entirely. And I reached out and took the flash drive from his hand. It was lighter than I expected. Evidence always is. Okay, I said. Tell me everything. Well, he told me for 2 hours. We drove. I needed to move. I needed the illusion of going somewhere while everything I thought I knew was being methodically replaced. Through the wet Seattle streets while Elias talked. And I asked questions, and the picture assembled itself the way pictures do when you finally have enough pieces. Not all at once, not with dramatic clarity, but incrementally, each piece connecting to the next, until what had been fragmentary became whole, and the wholeness was somehow worse than any individual piece had been. Wren Capital Group had begun as a legitimate investment firm. Harold Wren, in his 40s, had been a sharp and genuinely talented financial mind. That part was real. But somewhere in the late 1980s, as the firm grew and the clients multiplied and the money became so large it stopped feeling like individual people's futures and started feeling like an abstraction. A decision had been made. Not one dramatic decision, Elias explained. That was rarely how corruption worked. It was a series of small decisions, each one defensible in isolation, each one made easier by the one that preceded it. By the time my mother joined the audit division in 1991, the fraud was so deeply embedded in the company's structure that it had become, effectively, the structure. The legitimate business was a shell. The real business was the systematic redirection of investor capital. She spotted it within 6 months, Elias said. She was that good. She came to me because I was independent. I wasn't on their payroll. I was brought in for a specific project. She showed me what she'd found, and I told her she was right, and also that she was in serious danger. And she filed the report anyway, I said. She believed in the process, he said. There was no judgment in his voice. She believed that if you brought evidence to the right people, the right things would happen. She was a good person who hadn't yet learned that institutions protect institutions. My grandfather, Elias told me, had known about the fraud, had at certain points been complicit in it. Not the architect, but not innocent either. He'd looked away when looking away was profitable. He'd signed things he shouldn't have signed. He was, by Elias's account, a deeply complex and deeply flawed man who had done genuinely terrible things and also, in the end, tried to do one genuinely right thing. He came to me, Elias said, 4 years ago, through a letter. Anonymous return address, but I knew who it was from. He referenced things only 3 people in the world would know, and 2 of them were dead. He shook his head. He said he was dying. He said he'd spent decades telling himself that what happened to Claire was unfortunate, that it was the price of a larger machinery he couldn't control. He said he stopped believing that about the time he turned 75. A pause. He said he wanted to leave the truth behind even if he couldn't deliver it himself. He chose you, Ike, I said. He chose me because I was still alive and I still had copies, and I was the only person outside the company who knew where the bodies were buried, metaphorically. Elias glanced at me. Mostly metaphorically. Mostly. There's one case I'm not certain about. A regulatory auditor who was pushing toward the company in 2004 died in a single car accident on a dry road on a clear night. He said it with the flat precision of someone who has turned a fact over so many times it has become smooth and featureless. I'm not certain. I've never been able to prove it. I didn't say anything to that. We drove for a while in silence. The people still running Wren Capital, I said eventually. Who are they? He named names. 3 executives, 2 board members, a legal team that had been with the company for decades, people with civic profiles, charity boards, hospital wings with their names on them, the particular kind of public generosity that functions as camouflage. They know about the estate, Elias said. They know the documents. They've been working with Fitch for months to make sure the language is airtight. If you sign this morning, it's done, legally done, in ways that would take a decade to untangle, even if someone knew to try. So, what do we do? Elias reached into his coat pocket, carefully again, that deliberate slowness, and produced a folded piece of paper. I've spent 4 years preparing for this conversation, he said. I have contacts, not friends. I don't really have those anymore. But people who owe me information, who have reason to be interested in what I'm carrying. He unfolded the paper, a list of names, agencies, with handwritten notes beside each one. There's a federal investigator in the SEC's Enforcement Division. She's been looking at Wren Capital for 2 years and keeps hitting walls, because without a material witness connected to the estate, she can't get the access she needs. Your grandfather's death should have triggered an automatic estate review. That review hasn't happened because Fitch has been managing the timeline. She needs me, I said. She needs you and the drive and about 12 hours to get the right people in a room. He looked at me. Are you willing? I held the flash drive in my palm and thought about my mother at a kitchen window, thought about a woman who had protected me so completely that I hadn't even known there was something to be protected from. Thought about a man who had lived 81 years, made choices he spent the last decade of his life trying to unmake, and had left the final move in a game he couldn't finish to a grandson he'd never met. Thought about $340 million and the people it belonged to. Yes, I said. My phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Fitch. It was an alert from my bank. I looked at it. Account access temporarily restricted. Please contact your financial institution for assistance. I looked at Elias. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted. They know, he said quietly. How could they know? I haven't done anything. You didn't answer Fitch's call, Elias said, and you've been parked on a side street for 2 hours instead of driving to their office. He was very still. These people have been doing this for 40 years. They don't take chances. My heart was going somewhere it had no business going. So what now? Elias looked out the windshield at the rain-gray street, at the ordinary Tuesday morning moving past us, oblivious to everything that was happening inside this unremarkable car. Now, he said, we move very carefully, and we don't use your phone. And somewhere behind us, 3 blocks back, a black SUV that had been parked when we arrived had begun, very slowly, to idle. The black SUV didn't move fast. That was the thing that scared me most about it. Fast would have meant panic. Fast would have meant they were improvising, but it just sat there, 3 blocks back, engine running, not following, and not leaving, the way a cat sits outside a mouse hole, patient, certain, with absolutely nowhere else it needs to be. Don't look at it, Elias said. I'm not looking at it. You keep checking the mirror. That's because there's an SUV following us. It's not following us yet. That's the distinction. He said it the way he said most things. Flat, measured, the cadence of someone who has already run this scenario in his head many times and arrived at the conclusion that panic is a luxury. Right now they're watching. They want to know if you're going to come to your senses and drive to Fitch's office. They're giving you a window. And when the window closes? He didn't answer immediately. How much battery does your phone have? He asked instead. I looked. 63%. Turn it off, not silent, off, all the way off. Can you do that? Yes, but, do it now, please. I powered it down with the particular unease of someone removing a lifeline. The screen went black and the car felt immediately more isolated, more exposed, like pulling a curtain across a window you'd forgotten was there. They can track an active phone passively, Elias said. Triangulation off cell towers. It doesn't require your GPS to be on. The moment your signal goes dark, they'll know you've figured that out, which tells them something. But it also buys us time before they can confirm your location again. You know a lot about this. I've had 20 years to learn what I didn't know when your mother needed me to know it. There was something blunt and unadorned about the way he said that. Not self-pity, just accounting. I made mistakes. I'm trying not to repeat them. I pulled the Outback away from the curb and drove, not fast, not erratically, just a person driving through a rainy October morning, nothing to see here. And I watched in the mirror as the SUV remained where it was, and remained, and then, just as I turned left onto Clement, began, slowly, to move. They're coming, I said. I know. Take the next right. I took it. Now the alley behind the laundromat. You see it? I did. A narrow gap between buildings, dumpsters on one side. The kind of passage that doesn't appear on navigation apps because it was never meant to be navigated. I pulled in and cut the engine. We sat in the dark of the alley and listened. The SUV passed at the far end, didn't slow, kept going. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for approximately 4 city blocks. Okay, I said. My hands were not entirely steady on the wheel. Okay, I need you to explain to me exactly how much trouble we are actually in. Not the diplomatic version, the real one. Elias was quiet for a moment. In the dim of the alley, with the rain tapping on the roof, his profile looked like something from a much older world, like someone who had been carrying weight for so long the shape of it had become part of him. The real version, he said, is that these people have been protecting this secret for 40 years. They have legal resources, private security contracts, and relationships with enough civic institutions that any accusation against them, without ironclad documented evidence delivered through the right channels, will be turned against the person making it within 72 hours. He paused. They did it to your mother. They did it to me. They're very good at it. So they'll come after me. They're already coming after you. The bank account freeze wasn't a warning. It was the opening move. He turned to look at me directly. They want to put you in a position where signing is the path of least resistance. Freeze your accounts, create legal uncertainty around the estate, apply quiet pressure through Fitch about complications in the transfer timeline. And suddenly the $27 million that should be a straightforward inheritance feels contingent on your cooperation. That's manipulation. That's how they've operated for 4 decades, he said. It works because most people, when faced with that kind of pressure on something they want badly, choose to look away. They tell themselves someone else will handle it. They take the money and go. I thought about the 45 minutes I'd spent with Gerald Fitch in my office. His careful language, time-sensitive elements, the way he'd handed me the card with the precise confidence of a man who never seriously entertains the possibility of being refused. Had he done that exact same thing with other people? Had there been others connected to this estate, other loose ends, other people who'd been smoothly, professionally managed into compliance? The thought made my jaw tight in a way I couldn't entirely account for. The woman you mentioned, I said. The SEC investigator. Dana Richfield, Enforcement Division, Pacific Northwest Field Office. She's been building a case on Wren Capital for 2 years but keeps running into the same wall. Without documented access to the estate's internal structures, she can't compel the disclosure she needs. Fitch has been managing the estate's legal timeline specifically to keep her out. And you can't go to her yourself. I tried, twice. The second time, I was escorted out of the federal building by 2 people who made very clear, without ever using a word that could be quoted, that showing up again would result in a disorderly conduct charge. His voice was perfectly even when he said it. I have no standing, no credentials. Legally, I am a discredited former contractor with a documented history of making accusations against a company whose lawyers are better than anything a man in my position can access. He looked at the flash drive, which was sitting on the center console between us now. The evidence means everything, but evidence needs someone credible to carry it. And I'm credible. You're the heir to the estate. You're a named party in the legal proceedings. You have standing that I will never have. He met my eyes. And you have something else. What? You're angry, he said simply. Not performatively, not strategically. You found out tonight that your mother spent years fighting alone against something that destroyed her, and nobody helped her, and she died without justice, and the people responsible are still sitting in their offices making decisions that hurt other people. A pause. That anger is legitimate, and the right people, in the right room, will feel it. I sat with that. Outside, a gust of wind pushed a sheet of rain sideways through the alley entrance. Somewhere above us, a pigeon made a sound like a small complaint and moved on. We need to get to Dana Richfield, I said. Yes. Without using my phone? Yes. And without being followed. That will be the complicated part. I looked at him. 60-something, wet through, 20 years of patience worn into his face like topography. I thought about what he'd said. I made mistakes. I'm trying not to repeat them. I thought about my mother at 25 in a company lobby, smiling a smile I recognized, believing institutions would do the right thing. What did she look like? I said. The question came out before I'd decided to ask it. When you knew her, what was she like? Something shifted in Elias Voss's face, very carefully, like moving something fragile. She was the funniest person in any room she was in, he said, after a moment. Not obviously. She didn't perform it. She'd say one thing, very quietly, and if you weren't paying attention, you'd miss it, but if you caught it, he almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way there. She had no patience for pretense. None. She could identify a person who was performing wealth or authority within about 30 seconds, and she'd spend the rest of the interaction being perfectly polite while privately dissecting them, and she'd tell me about it afterward, and I'd laugh until I couldn't breathe. My throat was doing something it had no business doing in the front seat of a car in an alley. That's her, I said. My voice was not entirely stable. That's exactly her. She talked about you, he said. Every single day. You were maybe 3 when I knew her. She had a photograph of you in her desk drawer, and she'd take it out when she thought no one was looking. He paused. She would have done anything for you. She did do everything. I pressed my hand flat against the steering wheel and breathed through it. This was not the moment. I knew it wasn't the moment. There was a black SUV somewhere in the vicinity and a law firm waiting for a signature and 20 years of buried evidence on a flash drive between us. And this was not the moment to fall apart over a woman who had been gone for 6 years. I breathed through it anyway. Okay, I said when I could. Tell me how we get to Richfield. Elias reached back into his coat. The man had layers, actual layers of worn fabric, and somewhere in all of it, apparently, a significant amount of prepared contingency. He produced a folded page torn from what looked like a street map. Paper, actual paper, the kind nobody carried anymore. There's a public library on Yesler, he said, 8 blocks from here. They have computers for public use that don't require a login. I need 20 minutes on one of them to make contact through a channel that can't be traced back to either of us. What channel? An email address that forwards through 3 separate servers. I set it up 2 years ago for exactly this situation. He looked at me. I told you. I've had time to prepare. And Richfield checks it? She will when she sees what I put in the subject line. He didn't tell me what the subject line was. I didn't ask. I started the car. The alley was narrow enough that getting out required a 3-point turn and a prayer to no one in particular, and I scraped the passenger side mirror on a dumpster doing it, and Elias didn't comment on that, which I appreciated. We made it to Yesler without seeing the SUV. The library was a low brick building with automatic doors that wheezed open with a sound like an old lung and a lobby that smelled of wet umbrellas and warm carpet and the particular institutional quietness of public spaces that have decided collectively to be gentle. A few people at tables, a woman in her 70s doing a jigsaw puzzle at a corner table with the focused serenity of someone who had declared peace with the world. 2 teenagers with headphones, a man asleep across 3 chairs with his shoes neatly placed on the floor beside him, like he wanted it understood that he was a person with standards even in difficult circumstances. Nobody looked at us. I sat in a chair near the periodical rack while Elias went to the computers, and I tried to look like someone reading a 3-week-old issue of a regional business magazine while internally running something close to controlled terror. I thought about Dana Richfield. I thought about what Elias had said. 2 years keeps hitting walls. 2 years of building a case that someone kept finding ways to dismantle. 2 years of knowing something was wrong and not being able to prove it through legitimate channels. I understood that particular frustration in a way that surprised me, because I'd spent most of my professional career as a software architect dealing with systems that had fundamental flaws buried so deep in their foundations that every fix was cosmetic, every repair broke something adjacent, every legitimate solution ran into the structural reality that the thing was built wrong at its core. Ren Capital was a system built wrong at its core. My grandfather had known it. My mother had known it. Elias had known it for 20 years. The difference was that now someone had given me the schematics. Elias was back in 12 minutes. She'll meet us, he said, sitting down beside me with the careful movements of someone managing physical discomfort he'd learned not to advertise. 2 hours. There's a coffee shop on East Lake, Copper Street, it's called. She'll be in the back. She responded that fast? The subject line was the case file number from a 2003 SEC inquiry into Ren Capital that was closed under irregular circumstances. He folded his hands. She's been waiting for this particular email for a long time. I looked at him. You set this up before you even knew if I'd agree to help. I set it up in case you agreed, he said. There's a difference. What would you have done if I'd driven away at that red light? He was quiet for a moment. Waited, he said. For what? For whoever came next. Someone always comes next. He looked at the woman doing her jigsaw puzzle. Your grandfather was very specific in his letter to me. He believed you were the right person. He described you in detail. Your career, your habits, the way you think. He'd been watching you from a distance for years. Something cold and complicated moved through me at that. He watched me. He followed your career, your public work. He was proud of you. Elias said it gently, but he didn't look away from me. I know that information doesn't feel the way it's supposed to feel. A grandfather who was proud of you at a distance for 34 years and never picked up a phone. That's not pride, I said. That's spectatorship. He didn't argue. No, he said. It wasn't enough. He knew that. He said so. A pause. He also said he was a coward for most of his life, and that he didn't expect forgiveness from anyone and wasn't asking for it. He just wanted to leave something useful behind before the end. I didn't know what to do with Harold Wren. I still don't, fully. He was a man I never met who watched me from a distance and did nothing for 60 years and then, dying, tried to hand me a sword. There's a version of that story where he's the villain. There's a version where he's a tragic figure. There are probably versions where he's both simultaneously. What I know is that the sword was real, and I was holding it. We had 90 minutes before the meeting with Richfield. Too long to sit still in a library, too short to do anything useful with, and outside the SUV was somewhere in the city doing patient mathematics about where we'd gone. We can't go back to my car, I said. If they're any good, they have the plate by now. They absolutely have the plate, Elias said. Yes. So we walk. 8 blocks in the rain. You've done worse. He looked at me. Yes, he said, after a moment. I have. We walked. Seattle in the rain has a particular quality that I think you either make peace with or you don't. And the people who don't eventually leave. The water doesn't fall so much as it arrives, drifting sideways, finding gaps and collars, making the city feel like something at the bottom of a slow river. Elias walked beside me with his hands in his coat pockets and his head slightly down, the posture of someone who had learned to be invisible in public spaces, who had refined the particular art of being a person that other people's eyes slide right off. I thought about how long he'd been practicing that. We didn't talk much, partly because we were in public and partly because there wasn't much left to say in transit. We'd said the important things in the car, and what came next was the meeting, and the meeting was either going to be the thing that changed everything or the thing that confirmed we'd run out of road. Copper Street Coffee was the kind of place that had been there since before coffee shops became a lifestyle statement. No exposed brick with motivational quotes. No menu written in chalk with seasonal specials. Just tables and chairs and coffee that came in normal sizes and didn't have Italian names, and a back section separated from the front by a half wall with plants on it that had definitely seen better decades. Dana Richfield was already there. She was maybe 45, compact, with dark hair pulled back in a way that suggested she didn't have time to think about her hair and had solved the problem permanently rather than ongoing. She was in a gray blazer over a blue shirt, and she had a coffee cup in front of her and a leather document folio on the table, and the expression of someone who has been in enough important meetings to have developed a very calibrated resting face that revealed nothing. She looked at me first, then at Elias. Something moved behind her eyes when she saw him. Recognition, but more than that. Something closer to the feeling you have when a door you'd stopped expecting to open finally does. "Mr. Voss," she said. "Ms. Richfield." He sat down across from her. I sat beside him. "Thank you for meeting us quickly. The subject line of your email was sufficient motivation." She looked at me directly. Her eyes were sharp and brown and evaluated things. "You're Rowan Mercer, Harold Wren's grandson." "Yes." "You were supposed to be at Callaway, Hendricks, and Fitch at 10 o'clock this morning." "I was." "Something changed your mind." "Someone," I said. I nodded toward Elias. She looked at him again. "You've been trying to reach me for 2 years." "You've been building a case on Wren Capital for 2 years," he said. "We've been working on the same problem from different directions." "I couldn't take your previous contacts seriously," she said, and she said it without apology but also without cruelty. A walk-in with no documentation and no standing, making accusations against a firm with 30 years of clean regulatory history on paper. I'd have been putting my career on a bonfire. "I understand that. But now you have standing." She said this to me. "You're a beneficiary of the estate, a named party in the legal proceedings. And I have this." I put the flash drive on the table between us. She looked at it. She didn't touch it. What's on it? According to Mr. Voss, and I have no reason to doubt him, financial records documenting 40 years of fraud, recorded conversations, forged regulatory filings, and documentation of approximately $340 million redirected from investor accounts into private structures controlled by the current board. I kept my voice even. My grandfather compiled the core evidence in the last years of his life. Mr. Voss has been corroborating and expanding it for 20 years. Richfield picked up her coffee cup and set it down again without drinking from it. If this is what you're describing, she said carefully, this is not a civil matter. This is federal criminal fraud at a scale that would involve multiple agencies and a multi-year prosecution. I know. I need to be very direct with you about what happens if we proceed from this meeting. The moment I bring this to my supervisors, your life becomes significantly more complicated. You will be asked to cooperate formally. There will be legal protections available to you, but there will also be a period, potentially a long period, during which the people at Wren Capital will use every resource available to them to discredit you, professionally, personally, financially. She looked at me steadily. They did it to your mother. They did it to Mr. Voss. They are very effective at it. I know, I said. You understand that the inheritance, the $27 million, will be tied up in legal proceedings that could take years to resolve. I understand that. And you still want to proceed. I thought about the drive over, the rain, my phone sitting dead in my pocket, the SUV 3 blocks back doing patient mathematics, the bank account already frozen on a Tuesday morning before 10 a.m. by people who had decided, before I'd even made a decision, what I was going to do. I thought about my mother's natural smile in a photograph she didn't know was being taken. They already froze my bank account, I said, so they've already decided I'm a problem. The question of whether to proceed feels somewhat academic at this point. Something shifted in Richfield's expression. Not a smile exactly, but the first suggestion that the resting face had thawed a fraction. Show me what's on the drive, she said. Elias reached across and picked it up. Do you have a laptop? I have a laptop. She didn't open the folio. Instead, she looked at both of us. Before I do, Mr. Mercer, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Okay? Is there any part of you that is doing this out of personal anger toward your grandfather? Toward the estate? Any part of this that is about punishing Harold Wren's legacy rather than exposing genuine fraud? It was a sharp question, the kind that cuts differently depending on where you're standing when it lands. I understood why she asked it. She needed to know if I was a witness or a weapon. I thought about it honestly. I gave it the 30 seconds it deserved. My grandfather is dead, I said. I never met him. I'm angry about a lot of things, but none of them are things he can fix now. I looked at her. The $340 million belongs to other people. That's the part that matters. She held my gaze for a moment. Then she opened the folio and took out a laptop. What followed was 40 minutes that I can only describe as the specific experience of watching something enormous move. Like plate tectonics, slow, inevitable, the kind of motion you can't see in real time, but whose effects reshape geography. Richfield worked through the files on the drive with the focused efficiency of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for and kept finding it in places that made her expression tighten by increments. She asked questions in a clipped, precise way. Elias answered them with the fluency of 20 years of preparation. I sat with my hands around a coffee cup that went cold without me drinking from it and tried to understand that this was actually happening. At one point, she stopped and looked at a particular file for a long time without speaking. This is a recording of a board meeting, she said. July 2019, Elias said. The agenda was the pending SEC inquiry, the one you were building toward before the case file was closed. She looked up at him. The case was closed, she said slowly, because 3 of our key documentary requests were flagged as improperly filed, a procedural challenge that our office had 3 days to respond to and didn't catch in time. The challenge was filed by Fitch's firm, Elias said, on a Friday afternoon. She was quiet for a moment. And the recording documents a conversation between the board chairman and your division director at the time, Elias said, prior to the filing. Her face was very still. Mr. Voss, she said, are you telling me that my own division was... I'm telling you that the recording exists and you should listen to it yourself before you draw any conclusions. He paused. I don't think it was systemic. I think it was one person, one favor, for significant consideration. But you should hear it. She looked at the drive. She looked at Elias. She looked at me. I need to make a call, she said. Not to my supervisor, to someone outside the chain that intersects with Pacific Northwest operations. She stood up. Don't leave this table, both of you. She walked to the far corner of the coffee shop, phone already to her ear. I looked at Elias. He was looking at the table. You knew about her director, I said quietly. I suspected. I wasn't certain until her reaction just now. You could have told her up front. If I'd told her up front, she'd have spent the first 20 minutes managing her own shock instead of evaluating the evidence, he said. She needed to see the drive first. She needed to be certain of the evidence before I handed her a personal reason to react emotionally. I looked at him. You've thought through every part of this. I've had time to think, he said again, and then quietly, so quiet I almost missed it. I didn't think through enough of it 20 years ago, with your mother. He paused. I keep trying to run the scenario where I did something differently, where I caught it sooner, where I went public instead of going through channels, where I found a Dana Richfield in 2004 instead of 2026. He looked up. There isn't a version where it doesn't cost something terrible. I've made peace with that, mostly. I looked at this man who had lost everything and kept going anyway, in the rain, for 2 decades, because he'd promised something to a woman who was already gone. I tried to find words for what that was. I couldn't. Some things don't have words. They just have weight. Richfield came back. She sat down. Her resting face was completely restored, which told me nothing except that she was very good at her job. I've spoken with someone I trust, she said. We're going to need to move today. Not this week. Today. She looked at both of us. The estate signing was scheduled for 10 a.m. It's now 11:40. Fitch will be escalating. If the board believes you've gone dark, they may accelerate their own timeline to address the estate through alternative legal mechanisms. They'll try to have me declared non-responsive and pursue a contingency disposition of the assets, I said. She looked at me with the first trace of genuine surprise I'd seen on her face. You know estate law? I know systems, I said. The specific language varies, the logic doesn't. She almost smiled. Not quite. We need to get you both somewhere safe while I coordinate. There's a federal facility I can use that won't show up in any logs connected to the Pacific Northwest Enforcement Office. She looked at Elias. Can you travel? He blinked. Where? 12 blocks. On foot. Yes, he said. I can manage 12 blocks. Good. She closed the laptop, stood. Leave separately, 2 minutes apart. I'll go first. She looked at me one more time with those sharp, evaluating eyes. Mr. Mercer, what you're doing, I want you to understand that it matters. Not abstractly, specifically. There are investors in 3 states who lost retirement savings that we have never been able to trace back to a source. What's on that drive, if it holds up, and from what I've seen, it will hold up, gives those people something they've spent years not having. What's that? I said. An answer, she said simply. She put on her coat and walked out of the coffee shop into the rain. I sat there for a moment longer. Elias was sitting across from me, patient and still as he'd been since the red light on Fifth Avenue, since long before that, since longer ago than I could trace. She's right, he said. It matters. I know, I said. Your mother would have been... He stopped. I know, I said again. Quieter. I picked up the cold coffee and drank it. It was terrible. I drank it anyway because it was there and I needed something to do with my hands that wasn't shaking. Elias stood first. He pulled his coat straight with the dignity of a man who had decided, a long time ago, that he would maintain certain standards regardless of circumstances. He looked at me. 2 minutes, he said. 2 minutes, I confirmed. He walked out. I sat alone at the table in the back of the Copper Street Coffee for 120 seconds, watching the rain through the front window, thinking about all the things I didn't know yet. All the ways the next hours could go wrong, all the things that could still be taken from us before we got where we were trying to go. Then I stood up, put the flash drive in my inside jacket pocket, and walked out into the rain. Somewhere in the city, a black SUV was still looking for me, and for the first time all morning, that felt like their problem more than mine. The 12 blocks to the federal facility felt like 12 miles. Not because of the distance. My legs were fine. My body was doing what bodies do when adrenaline has been running long enough to become the new baseline, functioning on a kind of hollow efficiency, everything sharpened to the immediate task, everything else filed away for later. I could feel the flash drive in my inside jacket pocket with every step. A small, hard rectangle of plastic and metal that weighed almost nothing and somehow had the gravitational pull of something much larger. The rain had shifted in the hours since we'd left the library, gone from a fine, persistent drift to something with actual intention behind it, the kind that makes a sound when it hits flat surfaces and finds every gap in waterproofing you didn't know you had. By the third block, my collar was soaked through, and I'd stopped caring about it, which is its own kind of freedom. I kept 200 feet behind Richfield. Elias was somewhere behind me. I didn't check. Checking would mean turning around, and turning around meant looking like someone who was being followed. And looking like someone being followed in a city where someone was actually following you was the category of mistake that Elias had spent 20 years cataloging. I watched Richfield's back. Gray blazer, dark hair, the particular stride of someone who moves through public space as though it belongs to them by right rather than permission. She didn't look back at me once. At the 9th block, my eye snagged on something. A man in a dark jacket standing at the corner of a closed pharmacy, pretending to look at his phone. Normal enough. Except he'd been at the 6th block too, on the opposite side of the street, also looking at his phone. I registered it as a data point and kept walking and tried to remember exactly what Elias had said about their operational methods. They don't take chances. At the 10th block, I casually looked in the reflection of a storefront window and confirmed what I'd half suspected. Dark jacket, phone, maintaining a comfortable 150 feet behind me, professionally casual. Moving when I moved. I had two choices: speed up and close the gap on Richfield, which would confirm to Dark Jacket that I'd spotted him, because innocent people don't suddenly accelerate for no reason, or maintain my pace and trust that Richfield had chosen the facility destination for reasons that included this possibility. I maintained my pace. My heart, however, did what hearts do when the cognitive decision and the physical reality are not entirely in agreement. The facility, when we reached it, announced itself as nothing. A nondescript office building on a block with several other nondescript office buildings. The kind of architecture that communicates, in its very blankness, please look at something else. A directory in the lobby listed 3 government agencies, and 2 that appeared on closer inspection to not have websites. Richfield was already inside, holding the elevator with a look that said she'd clocked the Dark Jacket 2 blocks before I had. I got in. The doors closed. 2 of them, she said. Not a question. I only spotted 1. There were 2. The second was a woman, northwest corner, red umbrella. She looked forward at the elevator doors. They're good, but they telegraphed by using the same street rather than paralleling. They weren't expecting me to be paying attention, I said. No, they expected you to be scared. She glanced at me. Are you scared? I thought about it honestly. Yes, I said, but it's not the kind of scared that makes you stop. She made a small sound that might have been approval and might have been nothing at all. The floor we went to was not listed on the lobby directory. So, the room was small and aggressively functional. A table that had seen decades of use. 4 chairs. A whiteboard with remnants of previous writing that someone had erased inadequately. You could see the ghost of diagrams underneath. A secure terminal in the corner that Richfield moved to immediately. No windows. Elias arrived 4 minutes after me, wet and breathing slightly harder than he'd like to admit. He sat down at the table and pressed his hands flat against the surface and said nothing for a moment, just collected himself. There was a man already in the room when we arrived. He'd been introduced by Richfield, briefly, as Marcus Tran, federal prosecutor, brought in through a channel she described as separate from the chain I don't currently trust. He was in his late 40s, Vietnamese American, wearing a suit that fit extremely well and had the patient energy of someone who spent a lot of time waiting for people to arrive at important decisions and had made his peace with the pace. He'd been reading a document when we came in. He set it face down on the table. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "I've heard the outline from Dana. I understand you have documentation." I put the flash drive on the table. He looked at it the way Richfield had looked at it in the coffee shop, with the measured attention of someone who had trained themselves to hold excitement at arm's length until verification. "Mr. Voss," he said, looking at Elias, "you compiled this over 20 years. With the additions your grandfather provided in the last 18 months, Elias said to me, then back to Tran. "Yes. And you're prepared to testify to the chain of custody." "To every document I collected personally, yes. To Harold Wren's contributions, I have the correspondence, the letters. They're authenticated and dated through a private verification service I used 3 years ago." He reached into his coat again and produced a separate envelope, letter-sized, sealed. I had these prepared. Marcus Tran took the envelope and didn't open it yet. "I want to walk through something with both of you," he said, "because I need to understand the full picture before I make any recommendations about how we proceed." He opened the document he'd set face down. It was, I saw, a printout of what appeared to be the estate transfer paperwork, the documents I was supposed to have signed at Callaway, Hendricks, and Fitch 5 hours ago. I obtained a copy of these through a separate request this morning before Dana contacted me. I've been looking at Wren Capital for a different reason. A pension fund complaint that came across my desk 8 months ago. I hadn't been able to connect it to the estate. He looked at me. "Can I ask what made you stop?" "At the red light." "You could have driven away." I looked at Elias. "He said my mother's name for me," I said. "The name she called me. No one else knew it." Tran nodded slowly. "And that was enough." "It was enough to roll down the window," I said. "Everything after that was its own reason." He wrote something brief in a notebook. Then he looked at the flash drive again and then at Richfield, and something passed between them, the specific shorthand of people who have worked together long enough to have a compressed language for important things. "We need to move before 5 p.m., she said. "If Fitch files a contingency motion this afternoon, he'll file it by 3, Tran said. "That's my estimate." He looked at his watch. It was 12:47. "We have approximately 2 hours to verify enough of this material to justify an emergency injunction on the estate proceedings. If we can freeze the legal timeline through the court, it buys us the space to bring in the right agencies properly without Wren Capital's legal team being able to preemptively shield assets." "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Right now?" He pulled a legal pad across the table. "Your account of every interaction you've had with Gerald Fitch, beginning with his first visit to your office 3 weeks ago. Every word you remember, every document he showed you, every piece of paper you were given." He uncapped a pen. "Details that seem small often aren't." So I talked. I talked for 40 minutes while Marcus Tran wrote and occasionally asked questions that were short and precise, the kind of questions that aren't really questions so much as probes, pushing on specific points to test structural integrity. Dates. Exact language. The order in which things were presented to me. Whether Fitch had mentioned specific board members by name, whether any language in the estate documents had addressed contingencies in the event I declined to sign. That last one stopped me. "There was a clause," I said slowly, pulling at the memory. Fitch mentioned it briefly, almost in passing. Something about an alternative distribution mechanism in the event the primary beneficiary, me, was unable to complete the transfer. "Unable or unwilling?" Tran asked. I thought. "Unable," I said. "Specifically unable, not unwilling." Tran and Richfield exchanged another look. "That's significant," she said. "What does it mean?" I asked. "It means the documents were drafted with the assumption that they might need to have you declared legally incapacitated rather than simply non-responsive," Tran said, and he said it with the flat precision of someone delivering a diagnosis. "If you refuse to sign, they have no mechanism. But if they can establish that you are, for some reason, unable to make legal decisions, whether through a psychiatric evaluation they arrange, or through evidence of behavior they characterize as erratic, The contingency clause gives the estate an alternate path that bypasses your consent entirely. The room was very quiet. They were planning to have me declared incompetent, I said. Planning for the possibility, Tran said carefully. Whether they would have actually pursued it depends on how you'd responded to initial pressure. The bank account freeze, the legal timeline management, those are preliminary pressure tactics. If those worked, the contingency never needed to activate. He paused. But it was in the documents, as an option. I sat with that for a moment. I thought about Gerald Fitch in my office, his careful language, his precise handoff of the card, the way he'd said time-sensitive elements with the confidence of a man holding something over someone who didn't know yet what was being held. I'd read him as professionally detached. Now I was rereading the whole encounter with the new information laid over it like a transparency. And the picture that emerged was different, colder, more deliberate. He'd been assessing me. The whole visit had been an assessment. I felt something I can only describe as retroactive violation. The particular feeling of realizing that a moment you experienced as neutral was in fact something being done to you without your knowledge or consent. Like finding out a conversation you thought was casual was being recorded. I want to make sure I understand what I'm saying yes to, I said. My voice came out harder than I intended. Not in terms of the legal mechanics, I understand that. I mean in terms of what happens to me, personally, when this becomes public. Tran put his pen down. I'll be direct, he said. In the short term, difficult. Your professional life will be examined. Anyone connected to Wren Capital who has resources to do so will look for anything that can be used to characterize you as having a motive other than public interest. Prior employers, former colleagues, personal relationships. They will look for debt, instability, anything that could be used in front of a sympathetic media outlet to suggest that you are a disgruntled heir attempting to blow up a legitimate estate for personal reasons. He held my gaze. In the medium term, assuming the evidence holds, which, from what Dana has described it will, the legal protections available to you as a cooperating witness are substantial. In the long term, you will be the person who brought this down. What that means for your life depends on who you are. I looked at him. And Elias? Tran looked at Elias. Something shifted in the prosecutor's expression. Not softness exactly, but a kind of recognition. Mr. Voss has been living with a false record for 20 years. The documentation you've provided, combined with the evidence on that drive, gives us grounds to pursue formal expungement of every professional action taken against him. That's not a guarantee. These things move through systems at their own pace, but it's a real possibility. Elias was looking at the table. His hands were still. I don't need guarantees, he said quietly. I know, Tran said, but I wanted to say it anyway. It was the first time I'd seen Elias receive something. Not give, not endure, but actually receive something, and not immediately route it into the machinery of what needed to happen next. He just sat with it for a moment. A man who had been carrying something alone for 20 years being told, by a federal prosecutor in a windowless room on a rainy Tuesday in October, that someone was going to try to help him put it down. His jaw moved, just slightly. Then he looked up and the stillness was back. The board meeting recording, he said to Richfield. File 7 on the drive. That's where you need to start. The rest of the financial documentation is comprehensive but complex. It'll take your forensic team time to map, but the recording is 3 hours and 40 minutes of the board, in their own words, discussing the asset concealment structure. In their own words. He paused. It's the clearest single piece of evidence I have. She was already at the secure terminal. I'm pulling it now. What happened in the next 90 minutes I can only describe partially, because much of it was happening in legal and procedural channels that I was adjacent to, but not fully inside. Richfield worked the terminal. Tran made calls, brief, clipped, the kind of calls that are clearly one node in a larger network activating. Elias answered detailed questions about specific documents with the recall of someone who had reviewed the same files thousands of times across 20 years and had them memorized at a cellular level. I sat at the table and tried to be useful when I was needed and stay out of the way when I wasn't. At one point, Tran came back from a call and set his phone face down on the table and looked at me. "Gerald Fitch filed a motion 40 minutes ago," he said, "citing your failure to appear for the scheduled signing and requesting an emergency probate hearing to address complications in the primary beneficiary's engagement with estate proceedings." "They're moving," I said. "They're moving," he confirmed, "which means our window is tighter than 2 hours." He looked at Richfield. "Where are we on the injunction?" 30 minutes, she said, without turning from the terminal. "The judge reviewing it is someone I trust. She's going through it now." "Can she move that fast?" "She can if she's looking at what I sent her." A pause. "Which she is." Tran nodded. He looked at me. "There's one more thing I need to tell you, and I want you to hear it from me rather than finding out some other way." Something in his voice changed, just slightly, the professional precision getting a thin coat of something more careful. "What is it?" I said. He hesitated. The first hesitation I'd seen from him. In a man who appeared to be constitutionally opposed to hesitation, it was noticeable. "We cross-referenced the investor loss documentation on the drive against our pension fund complaint from 8 months ago," he said. "The complaint came from a class of investors in what was described to them as a diversified municipal bond fund. The fund was managed through a Wren Capital subsidiary." He paused. "As part of our preliminary inquiry into that complaint, I pulled the subscriber list, the people who put money into that fund." I waited. "Your mother's name is on it," he said. "Claire Mercer, formerly Claire Wren. She subscribed to the fund in 1998, 3 years after she left Wren Capital." The air in the room felt different. I don't know if that's possible, physically, but it's what I remember. The air quality changing. "She invested with them," I said, "after everything they did to her." "She may not have known the fund was connected to them. The subsidiary had a different name. It was designed to be opaque." He looked at me carefully. "The fund was closed in 2006. Investors were told it had been dissolved due to poor market performance and received approximately 12 cents on the dollar." He paused. "Based on the documentation on your drive, the actual returns, the real numbers before redirection, the fund's investors should have received full returns plus compound growth. Your mother's original subscription was $40,000. I did the math. $40,000, 1998, genuine compound growth through 2006. "They took that from her too," I said. "After everything. They took that too." "Yes," Tran said. "I'm sorry." I sat with it. What choice did I have? It was just another layer of the same thing, another row of the same terrible quilt. A woman who had documented their fraud, been destroyed for it professionally, watched them erase her reputation and her career and finally her health, and then, at some point in the aftermath, through some subsidiary with a different name, lost the money she'd put away for her old age she never reached. "Add her name to the list," I said. My voice was very even. "To the restitution documentation. Whatever class of investors is named in the complaint, add her name." "Her estate is yours," Tran said carefully. "She has no independent standing." "Then add it under my name, with notation that the original subscriber was Claire Mercer." I looked at him. "She was owed something. I want it on the record that it's owed, whatever happens with the money." He wrote it down. The room was quiet for a moment. Elias, across the table, was looking at a spot on the wall. His eyes were not entirely dry. He didn't make any effort to hide it, and he didn't acknowledge it, which was somehow both very human and very dignified. "She would have hated this room," he said, apparently to no one. "What?" I said. "No windows." He gestured vaguely. "She had a thing about rooms without windows. Said they made her feel like the world was trying to forget her." He paused. "She'd have lasted about 20 minutes in here before she started pushing furniture to see if there was a window behind the whiteboard." I looked at the whiteboard. Despite everything, the frozen bank account, the SUV, the $40,000, the contingency clause, the entire crushing weight of the morning, I laughed. It was a short laugh, not a clean one, the kind that has grief somewhere underneath it, but it was real. Elias almost smiled, the same almost smile from before, still not quite making it all the way there. "There it is," he said softly. "You've got her laugh." I didn't trust myself to respond to that. Richfield saved me from having to. We have the injunction, she said. The room recalibrated immediately. Tran was on his phone before she finished the sentence. Richfield was printing something from the terminal. Elias sat up straighter. The estate proceedings are frozen, she said, turning. Fitch's motion is automatically stayed pending review, which means they can't move the assets through the contingency mechanism, Tran said, finishing the sentence with his phone still to his ear. He held up a finger, listened, said 3 words into the phone, and hung up. We have teams moving on Ren Capital's main offices and 2 satellite locations simultaneously. Document preservation orders are being served in, he checked his watch, 11 minutes. I looked at the flash drive, still sitting in the center of the table where I'd put it 2 hours ago. What happens to that? I asked. It goes into evidence, Richfield said. Properly documented chain of custody. Your testimony about receiving it, Mr. Voss's testimony about compiling it, your grandfather's correspondence corroborating the additions. She looked at me. We'll make copies. The original stays with us. I picked it up, held it for a moment. This thing that had been wrapped in a photograph of my mother for however long Elias had been carrying it. This thing that had lived inside coats and through rain, and through 20 years of a man who had nothing left to lose holding on to it because he'd decided that was what he was going to do. I set it down on the table and slid it toward Richfield. She took it, carefully, like she understood what it had been before it became evidence. The board meeting recording, Elias said to Richfield. Make sure the teams know what they're looking for on the physical servers at the headquarters. The recording was sourced from an internal audio archive system. There should be backups on their primary server array. If we can corroborate the recording against their own archived files, it removes any chain of custody challenge, Tran said. Yes, I'll flag it. The coordination was escalating around me now. Tran was on another call. Richfield was in communication with someone via the secure terminal. A second person had come in, a younger woman in FBI credentials whose name I'd missed in the introduction, moving fast, handing Tran a document, talking quickly. I was no longer the center of anything. The machinery had engaged, and I had provided the thing that engaged it, and now it was doing what it was built to do. It was the strangest feeling, like having been the ignition key, and now the engine was running, and the key was just sitting there. I looked at Elias. He was watching the activity in the room with the expression of someone who has been waiting at a bus stop for a very long time and has just seen headlights coming around the corner. Not relief exactly. Relief might have been premature, and he was too experienced to reach for something premature. But a kind of stillness that was different from his usual stillness. Less like endurance and more like something easing. Hey, I said. He looked at me. When did you get to that overpass this morning? I said. What time? He considered. 7:15, roughly. You didn't know what time I'd drive through? No, but I knew the route you usually take to downtown, and I knew your appointment was at 10. I thought 7 to 9 was the window. He paused. You drive earlier than most people. I couldn't sleep, I said. Neither could I. He looked at his hands. I've been thinking about this morning for 4 years. What I'd say. How to make you listen. He was quiet for a moment. I had a whole prepared thing, a sequence. I was going to give you context first, establish credibility, reference your mother gradually so you'd have time to process before I got to the harder information. He almost smiled again, and again it didn't quite arrive. Then you pulled up at that light, and I looked at you and I just said your name, the real one. And everything else I'd prepared just, he made a small gesture. Fell apart, I said. Was unnecessary, he said. You rolled down the window. I almost didn't. I know. I almost drove away, I said. The light turned green and I almost, I know, he said. I could see it. What would you have done? Found another morning, he said simply. You weren't going anywhere. The estate proceedings take time. I had more mornings. I looked at him. You would have just kept coming back. As long as necessary. He said it without drama, without performance, the flat, factual confidence of someone who has already done the thing they're describing. What else was I going to do? That question hung in the air between us. What else was I going to do? Not a rhetorical question, a real one. The question of a man who had stripped his life down to a single remaining obligation and had organized everything around it. The question of someone who had lost family, career, home, credentials, comfort, everything most people construct their identity around, and had decided that none of it changed what he still owed to a woman who was gone and a cause that still needed completing. I didn't have an answer for him. I just looked at him, this wrecked, quiet, stubborn man. "I'm glad you came back," I said. He nodded, once, looked away. "Marcus," Richfield said from across the room. Her voice had a quality I hadn't heard in it before. Tight, controlled, the particular tone of someone holding something alarming at arm's length while they decide how to handle it. Tran looked up from his call. "We have a problem," she said. She turned the terminal screen so we could see it. It was a news alert. Local Seattle station, posted 6 minutes ago. The headline read, "Son of Wren Capital whistleblower sought for questioning in estate fraud allegations. SEC sources." I stared at it. "That's not from us," Tran said immediately, at the same volume you use when you need to be very clear about something. "Nothing we've done today would have generated that headline." "I know it's not from us," Richfield said. Her voice was controlled, but her jaw was tight. "It's from them." I read the headline again. "Sought for questioning, not cooperating with investigators, not assisting federal authorities, sought for questioning." The specific language of someone who is a suspect, not a witness. They'd gone to the media. They'd beaten us to the media. Before we could deliver the evidence, before the story could be framed by facts and documentation and 40 years of recorded fraud, they had planted a seed. One headline, one framing, sought for questioning. The kind of language that gets repeated, that gets searched, that shows up when someone types my name into a browser for the next decade. "They've done this before," Elias said. He was very still. "With Claire. They got ahead of the story before she could tell it herself. By the time she had a platform to speak from, the narrative was already set." "They're not going to do it this time," Tran said. He was already dialing. "Because this time the injunction is already filed and the evidence is already in federal custody, and the story they're trying to plant has a 17-minute head start." He put the phone to his ear. His voice was very controlled and very certain. "I've worked harder reversals than 17 minutes. I believed him, mostly. But I also understood what had just changed. The next few hours were not going to be about quiet, careful legal procedure moving at its own dignified pace. They had made it public, messy, loud, which meant we had to be louder and faster and clearer, and we had to do it on their timeline instead of ours. And somewhere in the city, reporters were going to start looking for me, and 2 people with a dark jacket and a red umbrella already knew roughly where I was. I looked at Richfield. "What do we do?" I said. She looked at the headline on her screen, looked at Tran, who was deep in his call, looked at me. "We stop being careful," she said, "and we start being fast." Being fast, it turned out, looked nothing like I expected. I had some movie-derived image in my head of what being fast meant in a federal context. People running, phones being slammed down, someone pulling up a map on a big screen and moving pieces around it with urgency. What it actually looked like was Marcus Tran sitting very still at the table making phone calls in a voice so controlled it was almost monotone, and Dana Richfield typing with the focused efficiency of someone diffusing something, and the younger FBI agent whose name I'd missed moving in and out of the room carrying printed pages that she handed to people without comment. What it felt like, from where I was sitting, was waiting, which is its own particular kind of unbearable. I am not, by nature, someone who waits well. I build systems for a living. I identify problems and architect solutions and implement them in sequences I can control and test and revise. What was happening in that room was none of those things. It was a machine I had helped start that was now running on its own logic, and my function in it was to be available when needed and stay out of the way the rest of the time. I kept my hands flat on the table to stop them doing anything involuntary. Elias, across from me, had no such difficulty. He sat with the stillness of someone who had spent 20 years in circumstances that required exactly this: the ability to be in a room where things were happening and not be the one making them happen and not fall apart from the tension of it. He watched. He answered questions when Richfield asked them. He didn't fidget. I looked at him at one point and said very quietly, "Does it get easier? The waiting." He considered this seriously, which I appreciated. He didn't give me the reflexive reassurance. "You stop fighting it," he said. "That's not the same as easier, but it's something." At 2:43 in the afternoon, Tron ended a call and looked up. "The document preservation teams are in," he said, "both the headquarters location and the Bellevue satellite office. We have a court-authorized hold on all financial records, electronic and physical, dating back 20 years. He paused. "Fitch's firm has filed an emergency challenge to the injunction." "Of course they have," Richfield said without looking up from the terminal. "Judge Carver is reviewing it." Tran looked at me. "Judge Carver is the same judge who issued the injunction. She's reviewed Fitch's challenge, she's reviewed the basis of our injunction, and she has, as of 11 minutes ago, denied the challenge and extended the preservation order to include a third Wren Capital subsidiary location in Tacoma. Tacoma, the city where I grew up, where my mother had stood at a kitchen window watching rain, where she'd lost her license and her career in an orderly, professional, institutional process designed to look like the truth. "Tacoma," I said, "a subsidiary that appears, based on preliminary review of your drive documentation, to have been the vehicle for the investor fund fraud." He looked at me with the careful attention of someone who remembers what they told you about your mother's name on that subscriber list. "Including the fund your mother subscribed to." I nodded. I didn't say anything. "The headline is the current problem," Richfield said, swiveling in her chair. She pulled up the news alert on her screen again. The 6-minute-old story had, in the 40 minutes since we'd first seen it, been picked up by 2 other outlets. The framing was consistent across all 3. Estate dispute, alleged fraud allegations, heir sought for questioning. One had added a photograph, not of me, but of Wren Capital's headquarters, all glass and steel and civic confidence. The visual language was clear: large legitimate institution, unnamed, troubled individual making allegations. My grandfather's company was the establishing shot. I was a question mark. "They're very good at this," Elias said. He'd seen the screen. "They've had practice." He said it without heat, just accounting again. "We need a counter-narrative in public by 5 o'clock, Richfield said to Tran, "before the evening news cycle sets." "I have a contact at the Post-Intelligencer," Tran said, "but I'm not going to a journalist with a story I can't fully document yet. That's not how I work." "What can we document now?" "The injunction is public record. The preservation orders are public record. The existence of a federal investigation. I can characterize it appropriately without breaching procedure." He looked at me. "And we have you." "Me?" "You, in your own words, before the story gets further set." He looked at me steadily. "A statement, not an interview. A prepared statement, reviewed by me before it goes anywhere, that establishes your position clearly, that you came forward voluntarily, that you are cooperating with federal authorities, that the characterization of you being sought for questioning is factually inaccurate." "Will it matter?" I said. "If people have already read the headline, it matters for the people who haven't decided what to believe yet," Richfield said, "which is most of them. A 6-minute head start is not a 6-hour head start, not if we move." I looked at the blank legal pad Tran had pushed to one side after taking my account of the Fitch meetings. "Give me 10 minutes, I said. He slid the pad across to me. I wrote for 12 minutes. I crossed things out. I rewrote. My handwriting got worse as I went, which is what happens when I'm thinking faster than my hand wants to move, and at one point Elias leaned over and read what I'd written so far and said, "Third paragraph. The sentence about your mother. Make it simpler." And he was right, so I did. What I had at the end of 12 minutes was not elegant. It was not the polished language of crisis communications. It was the statement of someone who had gotten in a car that morning to go collect a fortune they hadn't known existed a month ago, and had spent the day in the rain with a stranger who turned out to have known their mother, and had made a decision based on things that couldn't be fully explained in a press statement, but could be gestured at clearly enough that a person reading it would understand that the decision was real. I slid it to Tran. He read it. He made 2 small marks with his pen. Legal, not editorial. Slid it to Richfield. She read it. looked at me. "This is good," she said. And then, because she was the kind of person who qualified things appropriately, "It's not polished." "I know." "It reads like a person wrote it." "A person did." She almost smiled for the second time. The statement went out at 3:17 through a combination of Tron's media contact and a formal release through the Federal Investigations Public Affairs Office. By 3:45, it had been picked up by the same three outlets that had run Ren Capital's version of events. By 4 o'clock, the framing of the story had shifted perceptibly. Not completely, not cleanly, but the question mark had been replaced, at least partially, by something more complex, more human. I know this because Richfield was monitoring it on a tablet and giving us brief reports, and at 4:12 she said, "The Post-Intelligencer just updated their headline." She read it aloud. "Ren Capital Heir breaks silence, cites mother's legacy, and decades of hidden fraud in decision to cooperate with federal investigators." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Tron said, "That's a better headline," and went back to his call. It was. It was a better headline. It was not the headline I would have written. It had the slightly breathless quality of journalism trying to contain a story larger than its word count, but it said what needed to be said. It named her. In the headline, "My mother's legacy." Not an accusation or a question mark or a complication, a reason. I looked down at the legal pad, at my crossed-out, rewritten, messy handwriting. I thought about the third paragraph, the sentence about my mother that Elias had told me to make simpler. What I'd originally written was something complicated about her sacrifices and her integrity and the years she'd spent fighting alone. What Elias had suggested instead was just this. She tried to do the right thing, and it cost her everything. This is the least I can do with what she left. That was the sentence in the statement. That was the sentence in the headline now, distilled further, compressed into 5 words. Cites mother's legacy. She was in the headline. I don't know what I felt exactly. It wasn't clean enough to be called closure. It wasn't simple enough to be called relief. It was closer to the feeling you have when something that has been held in suspension for a very long time finally moves. Not lands, just moves. At 4:30, the dynamics of the room changed again. The young FBI agent, whose name I finally caught was Delgado, came in with a printout and handed it to Tran without speaking, the way she'd been doing all afternoon. But this time Tran read it, and his expression did something it hadn't done all day. Something that in a different person might have been surprise, but in him was more like recalibration, a very slight adjustment to an internal model. "What?" Richfield said. She'd read his face the same way I had. He set the printout on the table and didn't immediately speak. That pause from Marcus Tran was louder than most people's sentences. The forensic team in the Ren Capital headquarters found a secondary server room, he said, not listed in the building's official layout, behind a fire door on the 4th floor that was labeled as an electrical utility space. "Hidden servers," Richfield said, "hidden servers containing what appears to be a complete archive of internal communications going back to 1989. He looked at us. Every email, every recorded call that passed through their internal system, every document. He paused. Including communications from 2004, that reference, by name, the regulatory auditor I mentioned to you earlier. He looked at Elias. "The one who died in the single car accident," Elias said. His voice was very level. "Yes." The room held that for a moment. "What do the communications say?" I asked. "I don't have full details yet. What I have is a preliminary read from the forensics team that includes the phrase "problem resolved" in a message sent by the board chairman to 3 other board members, dated 2 days after the auditor's death. He was very careful with his language, very precise. That's not evidence of a crime on its own. It's a data point, but it's a data point that will be examined very thoroughly. I thought about what Elias had said in the car, mostly metaphorically. His careful qualifier, the thing he'd never been able to prove. I looked at Elias. His face was doing something complicated. Not satisfaction, it was too painful for that. More like a man who had been carrying a suspicion for 20 years that he'd never been able to confirm, watching it take its first step toward the light. "I want to be careful about expectations," Tron said, looking at both of us. This will take time. The communications will be examined. If there's a case there, it will be built properly. These things take time, I said. I know. I just want to make sure you understand that what happens next is a process. It's not a resolution. It's the beginning of a process that will take years. He looked at me with something that wasn't quite an apology, but was adjacent to one. The inheritance will remain in legal suspension during the federal proceedings. You won't have access to it. Possibly for a long time. I know, I said. You said that very quickly. I've had most of today to make peace with it. I looked at the blank wall opposite. I came into today thinking I was going to collect $27 million and it was going to change my life. It changed my life, just differently. He looked at me for a moment. Then, for the first time since I'd met him, Marcus Tran's controlled professional face allowed something genuinely human to surface. Not a smile exactly, more like the expression of a man who has been doing difficult work for a long time, and occasionally, not often, is reminded why he started. Yes, he said, differently. At 5:15, Tron told us that the immediate crisis phase was over. The preservation orders were holding. The injunction was intact. The media situation was not resolved, but was no longer running purely on Ren Capital's narrative. The next phases, the formal investigation, the prosecution timeline, the estate proceedings, would be long and complex and would involve armies of people with specialized expertise, and my role going forward would be to stay available, cooperate fully, and not do anything that could be characterized as interfering with proceedings. Meaning? I said. Meaning, don't talk to journalists without running it by me first. Don't contact anyone connected to Ren Capital. Don't attempt to access the estate assets independently. He paused. And get a lawyer. A good one, not connected to any firm with Ren Capital relationships. I can give you a list. I know someone, I said. He gave me a look. Someone I trust, I said. An old law school friend who does employment litigation. She's not in estate law, but she'll know who to call. Make sure she knows she'll be taking on something significant. I'll make sure. He nodded. Then he looked at Elias. His voice shifted, fractionally but noticeably. Mr. Voss, we'll need your formal testimony in the next 2 weeks, comprehensive. Every document, every source, every date. It'll be long. I'm prepared, Elias said. I know you are. He paused. In the meantime, is there somewhere you can stay? Somewhere you'll be? Is there anything you need? He asked it in the careful way of a professional who is trying to address a practical human problem without making it uncomfortable. Elias looked at him. I've been managing, he said. I know you have. I'm asking if you need to keep managing it alone. A beat. I have a spot, Elias said, under the Morrison Bridge overpass. I know the people there. It's... He stopped. Something crossed his face that he navigated quickly. It's fine. I know how to stay warm. Tran wrote something on a card and slid it across the table. This is a federal witness assistance contact. It's not charity. It's a formal program for material witnesses in active federal cases. You qualify. They can arrange temporary housing and basic support while the proceedings are ongoing. He looked at Elias directly. You've been sleeping outside in Seattle in October. You are a material witness in what may become one of the larger fraud prosecutions in this region's history. Let us do the minimal functional thing here. Elias picked up the card. He looked at it for a long time. Okay, he said finally. Quiet. Just that. One word. But the weight of it. The weight of a man who had refused to be helped for 20 years because helping required trust, and trust had cost him everything. Saying one word of reluctant, exhausted, finally permitted acceptance. That weight was enormous. I had to look away. Richfield started the process of officially logging our statements and documenting the day's events, which was its own lengthy procedural exercise. I answered questions. I signed things. I confirmed things. At some point, someone brought coffee, actual coffee this time, hot, in proper cups, and I drank it and felt the warmth of it in a way that was almost shocking, like my body had been waiting all day for something that simple. It was during this procedural settling that my phone, which Tran had asked me to leave off during the critical hours, and which I'd just been given clearance to restart, powered back on, and began receiving the messages that had accumulated since I'd turned it off outside the coffee shop. There were 37 of them. Most were from numbers I didn't recognize, journalists, I assumed, working from the statement. 3 were from colleagues at my firm, ranging in tone from concerned to baffled to one that was just a series of question marks. 2 were from my downstairs neighbor, whose relationship with news apparently moved faster than I would have expected. 1 was from a block number that was a single sentence. "You should have signed this morning. There is still time to correct this." I showed that one to Tran, who photographed it and said 3 words. "Good, thank you." And at the bottom, from 5 hours ago, a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize with a Spokane area code. I stepped out into the hallway to listen to it. I don't know why I needed the hallway. Some instinct about privacy, about not performing whatever was about to happen in front of other people. The voicemail was 40 seconds long. The voice was old. Careful in the way that very old voices are careful. Not frail, but deliberate, each word placed like something that had been thought about. A man's voice. Slightly hoarse. "Mr. Mercer, my name is Thomas Bray. I was Harold Wren's personal attorney, not Fitch, a separate arrangement he kept entirely private. I've been expecting to hear from you after the estate signing this morning, but you didn't sign, and I've been watching the news, and I think I understand why." A pause. "Mr. Wren left something for you that wasn't part of the formal estate documents. A letter. He was very specific that it was to be given to you only after you'd made your decision about the transfer documents, not before. He didn't want it to influence you." Another pause. "I think your decision was made quite clearly today. If you're willing, I'd like to bring it to you. I'm in Seattle. I've been waiting here since yesterday in case this day went the way it went." A long pause. "Your grandfather was not a good man for most of his life. He knew that. The letter says that. But he asked me to tell you, if I got the chance, that he was glad the last thing he did was real, whatever that means to you." The voicemail ended. I stood in the hallway with my phone in my hand and the buzz of the fluorescent light above me and the sound of the procedural activity continuing inside the room, muffled through the door. A letter. He'd written me a letter and arranged for it to be held until I'd decided. Like he understood that a letter from him, apology, explanation, whatever it was, would have been a manipulation. A reason to go one way or another that wasn't purely mine. So he'd removed it from the equation and let me decide in a vacuum and then offered it after. It was the most self-aware thing I'd yet encountered from Harold Ashford Wren. I didn't know what to do with that either. I went back inside. "I need to make a call," I said to Tran. "To whom?" I showed him the voicemail. He listened to it with his head slightly tilted, the way he processed everything, carefully, giving it the respect of full attention. "Thomas Bray," he said when it ended. "I don't know that name from the estate documents." "Separate arrangement," he said, "private." "Meet him," Tran said. "Here, if he's willing. I'd like to be present." "Is that for my protection or yours?" Considered. "Both," he said, without apology. I called Thomas Bray back. He answered on the second ring, which told me he'd been waiting. He agreed to come immediately. He was at a hotel 6 blocks away. He had been waiting, as he'd said, since yesterday. He arrived in 30 minutes. Thomas Bray was 80 years old if he was a day, short and solidly built, with white hair and the deeply tanned skin of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors and had for decades. He wore a suit that was good quality and 15 years old, the kind of suit you don't replace because it still fits and it still works, and you are not interested in performing anything for anyone. He carried a worn leather briefcase, and he moved with the particular deliberate quality of someone managing an artificial hip without advertising it. He shook my hand with a grip that said he'd had the same grip at 40. He looked at Elias, and something moved across his face. Recognition of a kind. "You're Voss," he said. "Yes," Elias said. "Harold mentioned you. He said it simply. He admired you. He was ashamed to say so out loud, I think, because of what it implied about everything else. But he mentioned you." Elias said nothing. Bray set the briefcase on the table and opened it. Inside, among various folders, was a standard white envelope, sealed, with my name on the front in handwriting that was shaky but deliberate. The handwriting of someone who had been very precise and had found precision harder than it used to be. He slid it across the table to me. He asked me to wait outside while you read it, Bray said, if you'd prefer. Stay, I said. I opened the envelope. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten on personal stationery with a header that had been crossed out. Apparently he'd started to write it on Ren capital letterhead and then thought better of it, and the crossing out was visible at the top of the first page. That detail hit me somewhere unexpected. A man who had spent his life defined by that company trying, in his last letter, to write on something that wasn't it. I won't quote the whole letter here. Some of it is mine. Some of it is about things I'm still deciding what to do with. But the part that mattered, the part I can tell you, was this. He wrote about my mother. He called her by her full name, Claire Elaine Wren Mercer, and he wrote about the day she came to him at the beginning, when she was just starting to document the fraud, before the report, before the compliance filing. She had come to him first, her own father. She had sat in his office with the evidence she'd collected, and she had laid it out for him, and she had asked him to make it right. He had told her she was wrong. He had told her she had misunderstood the data, that she was a junior auditor looking at systems she didn't fully comprehend, that the company's regulatory team had reviewed everything and found nothing actionable. He had lied to her, and then he had called the board, and they had done what they did. He wrote, I told myself for 20 years that I protected the company because I believed in it. That is not entirely false, but I also knew what she'd found was real. I knew it the day she showed me. I chose the company over my daughter, and I watched what they did to her, and I told myself it was necessary, and then I watched her die, and I stopped being able to tell myself anything. He wrote, You don't know me. You have no reason to forgive me. I am not asking you to. What I'm asking is that you let me leave something useful behind. The evidence is real. The people I worked with for 50 years are criminals. The money they stole belongs to people who needed it. I was one of the people who let it happen, and I am sorry for that in ways that words are inadequate for, and I know that. I want the last thing I did to be real. The last line of the letter was not addressed to me. It was addressed to her. I'm sorry, Claire. I'm so sorry. I should have been your father. I set the letter down. The room was very quiet. I was aware of people in it. Tran, Richfield, Elias, Bray. I was aware of the fluorescent light and the inadequate whiteboard and the smell of burnt coffee from a carafe that had been left on its warming element too long. I was aware of all of these things with the particular sharpened peripheral awareness you get when something in your center is doing something you can't control. I pressed my hands flat on the table, breathed. Elias was watching me from across the table. His expression was the most open I'd seen it all day. Not performing anything, not managing anything. Just there. Just a man watching another man receive a weight he'd been bracing for without knowing it. He knew, I said. Not to anyone specifically. From the beginning. She came to him, and he knew, and he... Yes, Elias said. He chose the company. Yes. She trusted him. She went to her father first. That's who she was, Elias said, quietly. She always believed in the right channel, even when she shouldn't have. I thought about Claire Mercer sitting in her father's office, young, certain, carrying evidence she'd spent months compiling, looking at a man she believed would do the right thing because he was her father, and fathers were supposed to do the right thing, being told she was wrong, being managed, sent away, then going back to her desk and filing the report anyway, because that's who she was. She'd been betrayed by the first person she told, and she'd filed the report anyway. I thought about that for a long time. Thomas Bray was watching me with the patient attention of a very old man who had learned that the right thing to do in certain moments is simply to be present and not speak. The letter, I said eventually. Does it constitute a formal admission? Tran, who had read it after me, looked up. It's potentially significant as a supplementary document. Admissions of knowledge are not the same as evidence of direct participation in fraud, but combined with the drive documentation, he stopped himself, looked at me more carefully. Why are you asking? Because if it's usable, I said, I want it used. I want it in the formal record. I don't want it kept private to protect his reputation posthumously. I looked at the letter. He asked me to let him leave something useful. This is useful. Rowan. It was Elias, and it was the first time he'd used my actual name all day. Not the nickname. My actual name. You don't have to decide that right now. I know. Take time with it. I know. I looked at him, but I think I already know what I'm going to decide. He held my gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. Slowly. The nod of someone who expected nothing less and is still moved to see it. Outside, through the walls of the building, through the layers of concrete and institutional blankness, the city continued. The rain continued. Somewhere a black SUV had either found somewhere to park or given up for the day. Somewhere Gerald Fitch was on the phone with counsel. Somewhere, in the Wren Capital headquarters on the waterfront, people who had spent 40 years building something on broken ground were beginning to understand that the ground was moving. And in a windowless room in a federal building, a man I'd met at a red light 8 hours ago was sitting across from me with his hands flat on the table, looking like someone who had finally, after 20 years, been allowed to put something down. I folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, held it for a moment. Then I slid it across the table to Marcus Tran. Use it, I said. He picked it up carefully. There will be a shareholders' summit next week, Richfield said, into the quiet. Wren Capital's annual investor meeting. It's been scheduled for months before Harold Wren died, before the estate proceedings, before any of today. There will be journalists there, investors, the board, obviously, and as of today, a federal investigation that they don't yet know the full scope of. She looked at me. We may need a public moment, something that locks the narrative before their legal team can restructure it again. What kind of public moment? I said. She and Tran exchanged one of their compressed looks. You're the heir, Tran said. You have standing. With proper legal preparation, you have the right to address the shareholder meeting. He paused. It's not the approach I'd choose in a normal case, but this case stopped being normal approximately 6 hours ago when they went to the media first. I looked at the envelope in his hand. My grandfather's letter. 4 pages of handwriting that had gotten worse toward the end because his hands were failing and he'd kept going anyway. I thought about standing in a room full of people who had invested their money and their trust in a company that had eaten it. I thought about $340 million. I thought about my mother going back to her desk and filing the report anyway. When is it? I said. 6 days, Richfield said. 6 days. I looked at Elias. He was looking back at me with those gray awake eyes that had been awake and watchful and waiting for this for 20 years. I'll need a suit, I said. And for the first time all day, for the first time, I think, in a very long time. Elias Voss smiled. Not the almost smile, not the nearly there suggestion of one. An actual smile, tired and weathered and real, that changed his whole face. I know a good tailor, he said. The suit was navy blue, not the charcoal I'd have chosen for myself, not the safe corporate gray that said I belong in this room, and you should not question that. Navy blue, which Elias's tailor, a 60-year-old Korean-American man named Paul, who operated out of a narrow shop in the International District, and who greeted Elias with the particular warmth of someone who has watched a person survive something difficult over a long period of time, said was the right choice because it was authoritative without being aggressive, and because it was the color my mother had been wearing in the 1993 photograph. I didn't tell Paul that. I don't know if Elias had. Maybe Paul just knew. He had the eyes of someone who reads people the way other people read rooms. I stood on his fitting platform in my undershirt while Paul moved around me with pins and chalk and the focused attention of a craftsman, and I looked at myself in the 3-panel mirror and tried to recognize the person looking back. 6 days had passed since the windowless room. 6 days since I'd slid my grandfather's letter across the table to Marcus Tran and said, use it. 6 days of the kind of events that don't feel real while they're happening and only become real later, in retrospect, like photographs developing. What happened in those 6 days? Wren Capital's board chairman, a man named Jeffrey Harlan, had retained 4 separate law firms in 48 hours. Gerald Fitch had issued a public statement characterizing the federal investigation as politically motivated harassment of a century-old institution. The two individuals who had followed me and Richfield through the rain, dark jacket, red umbrella, had been identified as employees of a private security firm contracted by Wren Capital, and that contract was now part of the discovery record. Two of Wren Capital's 5 board members had quietly engaged personal counsel separate from the company's legal team, which Tran told me was the specific behavioral signature of people beginning to calculate individual rather than collective survival. And the hidden server room on the 4th floor had yielded, upon full forensic examination, 114,000 internal communications spanning 37 years. 114,000. The 2004 communications about the regulatory auditor, the one who had died on a dry road on a clear night, were among them. I wasn't told the details. Tran was very deliberate about what he shared with me and what he held back, for reasons that were both protective and procedural. But he told me carefully that the communications had been referred to a separate investigative team, and that the word separate was doing significant work in that sentence. I stood on Paul's platform and looked at the Navy suit taking shape and thought about my mother at 25 in a company lobby, and about a man who had spent 81 years being one thing and died trying to be something else, and about what it meant that the last real act of his life had found its way, through all the years and all the broken channels, to a red light on a Tuesday morning in October. "Hold still," Paul said, around a pin between his teeth. "Sorry," I said. "You're thinking too hard. I can feel it in your shoulders." "Probably." "Think after." He made a small adjustment at the lapel. "Right now, just stand." So I stood. Well, the Wren Capital Shareholder Summit was held at their waterfront headquarters, the same glass and steel building that had been the establishing visual in the news coverage 6 days ago. 40 stories, harbor views, a ballroom on the 3rd floor that could seat 300 and had, for 20 years, hosted the annual gathering where investors were told how well their money was doing. This year, for the first time, a significant number of those investors knew that was not the whole story. Tran had worked with his media contact carefully in the days leading up to the summit. Not a flood, a measured release. Enough verifiable documentation through proper channels to establish the federal investigation as real and serious. Enough that the journalists attending the summit would arrive with questions that the board would not have prepared answers for. Enough that the investors in that room would walk in knowing something was wrong, even if they didn't yet know everything. The board's legal team had attempted 3 times in 6 days to have my invitation to the summit. As a state heir, I had formal shareholder standing that predated any of the current legal proceedings, declared void or suspended. All 3 attempts had been denied by Judge Carver, who appeared to have formed a clear and durable impression of the people making them. I arrived at 9:40 for a 10 o'clock opening. Richfield was in the building already, coordinating with a federal presence that was technically there in an observer capacity and practically there in a very different capacity. Tran was outside on a call, in a car parked on the street in a way that was not technically a law enforcement vehicle staging position, but looked exactly like one. Elias was in the lobby. He was wearing a suit I hadn't seen before, borrowed, he told me, through the Witness Assistance Program, from a closet of donated professional clothing that the program maintained for exactly this category of situation. It didn't fit him perfectly. The shoulders were slightly wide, the sleeves a 1/4 inch too long. He'd done something with his hair. He looked like a man who was wearing the idea of what he used to be, holding it around himself, seeing if it still fit. It mostly fit. He looked at me when I came through the door, looked at the navy suit. His expression was hard to read, which had become, over 6 days of seeing him regularly, something I'd learned to pay attention to rather than try to decode. When Elias's expression was hard to read, it usually meant something large was happening underneath and he was managing the surface. "You look like her," he said. I didn't have an answer for that. "Around the eyes," he said. "You always did. I saw it at the red light." We stood in the lobby of Wren Capital's headquarters, the building my grandfather had built and my mother had worked in, and both of them had been destroyed by. And we looked at each other, and I thought about all the mornings Elias had stood in the rain waiting for a version of this day to be possible. "Ready?" I said. He straightened the borrowed suit jacket at the lapels, a deliberate gesture, the gesture of a man deciding something. 20 years ago I wasn't ready, he said. Today's the other kind. We walked in together. The ballroom at full attendance was 312 people. I counted later from the registration records. In the moment, it felt like more. The particular amplification effect of a room where everyone knows something is wrong but no one has yet named it publicly, where the air itself seems pressurized with things not yet said. The board was on the stage when I entered, 5 of them at a long table, the chairman Jeffrey Harlan at the center. He was 70, silver-haired, the physical embodiment of the kind of authority that comes from spending 50 years in rooms where your authority was never seriously questioned. He had the specific quality of a man who had learned to mistake the absence of challenge for the correctness of his position. He saw me come in. Something moved across his face, very quickly, controlled immediately. But I saw it, and I think the people near me saw it, and I suspect some of the journalists in the room saw it. The specific expression of a man who had been told by his lawyers that this was a possibility and had not, until this moment, entirely believed it. I found a seat in the 3rd row. Elias sat beside me. The woman on my other side, 60s, gray hair pulled back, a notepad in her lap, looked at me and then did a small double take. She'd seen the statement. She recognized me. "Are you?" she started. "Yes," I said. "I'm Ruth Calloway." She said it like it meant something, and then, reading my face, clarified, "I invested $300,000 in a Wren Capital municipal bond subsidiary in 2001. My husband and I. It was our retirement fund." She paused. "We got about $38,000 back when they closed it." I looked at her. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry," she said, with the particular directness of a woman who had been waiting a long time for something and was not interested in social comfort right now. "Just do what you came to do." The meeting opened with Jeffrey Harlan at the podium. He was good, I'll give him that. He was very, very good. He had the voice of someone who had spent decades making complicated things sound settled, making concerning things sound managed, making questions sound like they'd already been answered. He opened with the company's history, its longevity, its community relationships, the hospital wings, the scholarship funds, the particular brand of civic generosity that functions, as Elias had said, as camouflage. He talked for 12 minutes before acknowledging, in language so careful it barely registered as acknowledgement, that the company was currently engaged with regulatory inquiries that we are confident will be resolved through proper channels. Engaged with regulatory inquiries. Passive, institutional, designed to make an active federal fraud investigation sound like a scheduling conflict. I watched the room while he spoke. I watched investors with notepads, journalists with recorders, a woman in the back who was crying quietly and trying not to be noticed, a man in his 70s who sat with his arms crossed, and the expression of someone who had driven a long way to ask a question and was calculating when the moment was. When Harlan opened the floor to questions, 6 hands went up immediately. The moderator, a company employee, I noted, not a neutral party, called on a man in the front row who asked a question about Q. 3 projections that was so clearly a planted question that 3 journalists in my immediate vicinity visibly wrote something in their notes. The second question was from a journalist, sharp, direct, about the federal investigation, the preservation orders, the specific allegations contained in the public portions of trans filings. Harlan answered it with the smoothness of someone who had been prepped for exactly this question and deployed the answer like a defense mechanism, acknowledging nothing, questioning the characterization, referencing the company's legal team's confidence. The third question was from Ruth Calloway. She stood up with her notepad, this woman who had put her retirement in a fund that returned 11 cents on the dollar, and she asked, in a voice that did not shake, exactly what had happened to the municipal bond subsidiaries' investor funds between 2001 and 2006, and whether the board had any documentation of the returns that had been reported to investors versus the actual performance of the underlying assets. The room changed, not dramatically, not like a movie, more like a pressure shift, the kind you feel in your ears when altitude changes. The air in the room became different, Harlan's answer was composed and technically constructed and said almost nothing. And everyone in the room, I think, understood that it said almost nothing. And the understanding of that moved through 312 people like something physical. My hand went up. The moderator looked at me, looked at Harlan. Harlan's expression was controlled. He gave a small nod that cost him something. I stood. I want to be honest about what that moment felt like, because I think the honest version is more useful than the version where I tell you I felt strong and certain and righteous. What I felt was a specific physical sensation in my chest that I can only describe as every version of myself from the last 6 days. The one in the alley, the one in the library, the one in the windowless room reading a dead man's letter, all arriving simultaneously and occupying the same body and making it hard to breathe normally. I breathed anyway. "My name is Rowan Mercer," I said. "I am the sole heir to Harold Ashford Wren's estate, which makes me a shareholder of record in this company." I paused. My voice was steadier than I expected it to be, which I attributed to having stood on a platform in Paul's tailor shop for 90 minutes being told to hold still. I was supposed to sign inheritance transfer documents 6 days ago that would have placed the hidden asset structures of this company, the structures that were used to redirect investor funds for 40 years, under the permanent control of the current board. Another pause. I didn't sign them. Instead, I brought documentation of what those structures were used for to federal investigators. That documentation is now part of an active federal fraud investigation. The room was very quiet. Harlan's expression was doing something complicated underneath its surface. "I want to say something directly to the people in this room who invested money in this company," I said. I looked at Ruth Calloway. She was looking back at me with the expression of someone watching something they stopped believing would happen actually happen. "The money you lost wasn't lost. It didn't evaporate in a bad market or dissolve in regulatory complexity. It was taken, deliberately, systematically, over decades, by people who relied on the fact that the machinery was complicated enough that you wouldn't be able to trace where it went." I reached into my jacket pocket. I had discussed this part with Tran. He had approved it, with conditions. Nothing that breached the evidentiary record, nothing that prejudiced the investigation, nothing that could be used to challenge the proceedings. What I was about to do was technically legal, carefully bounded, and also, I think, what I had actually come here to do. I pulled out a single folded page. A summary document prepared by Tran's team that represented the public-facing portion of the investigation's preliminary findings, asset figures, fund names, dates, the specific structure of the redirection mechanism, in language plain enough that a person who hadn't spent 20 years as a forensic accountant could understand it. I held it up. "This is a publicly available summary of the federal investigation's preliminary findings," I said. "It has been filed with the court. It is part of the public record. I'm going to place copies of it on every seat in this room before I sit down." The moderator said, "Mr. Mercer, this is not... I'm a shareholder of record, and this is publicly filed information," I said. "I have the right." I looked at Harlan. He was looking at me with an expression that had finally dropped most of its control. Not rage, something colder and more honest than rage. The specific expression of a man watching something he'd spent decades preventing happen anyway. "My mother worked for this company," I said. "Her name was Claire Wren. She found what was happening and she tried to stop it through the right channels. She came to her father first, to Harold Wren. He turned her away." I stopped, breathed. "Then she filed a report through the compliance office. This company destroyed her career, destroyed her reputation, destroyed 20 years of professional work. She died at 52 without her name cleared." I looked at Harlan directly. The same people who did that to her were still running this company until 6 days ago. Somewhere in the room, someone started crying. Not quietly this time. "I'm not standing here for the inheritance," I said. "I'm standing here because my mother came to this building 30 years ago with the truth and nobody would receive it. And I thought someone should finally stand in this room and say her name." I said her name. "Claire Wren," I said. "She tried to do the right thing, and it cost her everything. That is what she was, and that is what this company did." The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. I counted them. They were very long seconds. Then Jeffrey Harlan stood up, and the room erupted. Not in cheers, not in the clean, dramatic surge you might imagine. It was messier than that. Voices, questions, people on their feet, a journalist near the front pushing toward the stage, the moderator calling for order in a voice that had lost its authority. Two of the board members, the two who had retained separate counsel, were already in quiet conversation with people I recognized as part of Tran's team, conversations that were technically not arrests, but had the structural shape of arrests. Someone grabbed my arm. A large man, security, the private contractor kind and not the federal kind. His grip was hard. "You need to come with me," he said. "I really don't," I said. "Sir, Dana." I said it at normal volume, and Richfield appeared from the right side of the room at a pace that was technically walking, but was moving much faster than walking usually does, her federal credentials out, and the security contractor looked at them and made the calculation that you make when you are a private employee and a federal officer is standing in front of you, and he let go of my arm. "Thank you," Richfield said to him in a voice that indicated she was not thanking him. She looked at me. "You went slightly off script," she said. "I said her name," I said. "Tran approved the content." "He approved the document distribution. He did not specifically approve the part where you—" She stopped. Something moved through her controlled expression. "It was the right call," she said, almost against her will. "It's fine. It's on every recorder in the room, which means it's on every broadcast tonight, which means—" "It's in the record," I said. "It's in the record," she confirmed. From the stage, I heard Jeffrey Harlan's voice, still attempting authority, attempting the composure that had served him for 50 years. I didn't listen to what he was saying. I turned around and looked for Elias. He was where I'd left him, third row, still seated while everyone around him was standing. He was looking at the stage. His hands were in his lap. His face was doing the complicated thing it did when something large was happening underneath. I sat down next to him. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Around us, the room continued its controlled chaos. Tran's team moving, journalists pushing toward the front, investors talking in urgent clusters, the two board members now clearly in the kind of conversation that had lawyers implied in every sentence. "She would have hated the suit," Elias said. "Not my suit, the chairman's." He nodded toward the stage. "She had a category for men who dressed to communicate how much they deserved to be in the room." He paused. "She called it performance armor." "That's a good phrase," I said. "She had a lot of good phrases." He was quiet for a moment. "You said her name." "Yeah." "In that room." "Yeah." He looked at the stage. "Good," he said. Just that. One word, in the voice of someone for whom that word was carrying 30 years. Jeffrey Harlan was placed under federal arrest at 11:47 a.m. in the building's private elevator, attempting to reach the parking structure. He was accompanied by two board members who were also placed under arrest. The other two had already, in the preceding 40 minutes, agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for consideration, a calculation that their separate lawyers had apparently been preparing them for since day 3. Gerald Fitch was arrested at his law firm at 1:15 that afternoon. The hidden server room's communications regarding the 2004 regulatory auditor were formally referred to a homicide investigative unit at 3 p.m. the same day. That investigation is still ongoing. I don't know where it ends. I know it started. I found out about all of this in pieces over the hours following the summit, from Tran and Richfield in a series of brief communications as I sat with Elias in a coffee shop 4 blocks from the waterfront, not Copper Street, a different one, chosen because neither of us had been inside it before and clean spaces felt important right now. We drank actual good coffee. We sat at a window table. The rain had finally stopped, temporarily, and Seattle in the rare, weak October sunlight had a quality that felt almost apologetic, like it was aware of how long it had been gloomy and was trying briefly to make it up to you. I told Elias about the arrests as the updates came in. Each one he received with the same stillness, not celebration, not the relief of a man watching enemies fall. Something quieter and more complicated than either. The feeling, I think, of a person watching something that has been wrong for a very long time begin to be corrected. Knowing that correction and justice are related but not the same, knowing that the people who lost money won't get all of it back, that the people who lost years won't get those back either, that my mother won't know any of this happened. That last part doesn't get resolved. I've had to learn to hold it without trying to resolve it. At 4:30, a message from Tran. Estate proceedings formally separated from fraud investigation. Your inheritance will be restored to straightforward probate. Timeline still uncertain, but no longer suspended by bad faith motions. The $27 million was, somewhere in the legal machinery, beginning its slow movement toward clarity. I looked at the message for a moment. A month ago, that number had been the whole horizon, everything I was driving toward. Now it was real, yes. Significant, yes. I wasn't going to pretend that financial security was nothing. I had a one-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill that needed repainting and a cracked dashboard and a heating system at 60%, and the idea of not having those things as permanent features of my life was still meaningful. But it was not the thing I'd set out to do that morning. What I'd set out to do that morning was collect an inheritance I hadn't known existed from a grandfather I'd never met. What I'd actually done was something I couldn't have planned and wouldn't have chosen and would do again without hesitation, which I think is the definition of a decision you actually mean. What happens to you now? I asked Elias. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, thought about it. Testimony, he said. The formal deposition will take weeks, multiple sessions, every document, every date, every source. They'll want everything reconstructed in sequence. He didn't seem daunted by this. He seemed, if anything, like a man who had been waiting a long time for someone to finally ask him everything he knew. After that, he stopped. The Witness Assistance Program runs for the duration of active proceedings, housing, basic support. That's several years realistically. And your credentials, I said, your accounting certifications. Trent said there were grounds for expungement. He said it was a real possibility, Elias said, with the precision of someone who had learned not to treat possibilities as certainties. I'm not building a life plan around it. You could work again, I said, if the credentials come back. I'm 64 years old. That's not an answer. He looked at me sideways. The expression of a man being pushed gently on something he hasn't let himself push himself on. I don't know, he said. I genuinely don't know what I do with a normal life. I haven't had one in a long time. You learn, I said. That's all. You just learn. He looked out the window. The weak sunlight was already retreating, the clouds reassembling for what would be another several months of the persistent Pacific Northwest gray. Your mother used to say something, he said after a moment, when things were hard, when the evidence wasn't coming together or the institutional walls weren't moving, she'd say, he stopped. A small, careful breath. She'd say, the work is the work. You do it because it's there, not because you can see the end. I sat with that. The work is the work. She said that to you, I said. Many times. She never said it to me, I said. Not in those words. She said it in other words, he said. She raised you. Everything she believed, she put it into how she raised you. He looked at me. You did today. Without knowing, that's what it was. I looked at the window. In the weeks and months that followed, and I'm telling you this now, from some distance, from a vantage point where I can see more of the shape of what happened, several things became true that I need to tell you about, because the story doesn't end at the shareholder summit, and it doesn't end with the arrests. The federal fraud prosecution moved forward with the kind of slow, grinding institutional momentum that feels inadequate to the scale of what it's addressing, until, suddenly, it doesn't. Guilty pleas began coming in at month 4. Harlan and 2 board members fought the charges. Their trials were set for the following year. Fitch cooperated in exchange for a reduced sentence recommendation that Tron described to me neutrally as appropriate given the information he provided. The investor restitution process was complex and imperfect, and took longer than anyone wanted. Ruth Calloway, the woman who had sat beside me in the ballroom with her notepad and her $300,000 reduced to $38,000, received a formal notification of her inclusion in the restitution class at month 6. What she'll ultimately recover, and when, is still being determined. She wrote to me, she thanked me. I told her not to thank me. Her question had been the one that changed the room's pressure. I thanked her back. Claire Mercer's name was formally included in the investor restitution class, designated under my name as a state representative. It's not much. In the arithmetic of everything that was taken from her, $40,000 compounded from 1998 is a small number. But her name is in the record, in the official record, in a federal proceeding, connected to the truth of what happened to her and what was owed to her. She is no longer an unofficial casualty of something that officially didn't happen. That matters to me. It matters more than the money. The expungement proceedings for Elias Voss's professional record were initiated at month 3. They moved, as Tran had warned, at their own pace. But they moved. I checked. I kept checking. The inheritance, my grandfather's estate, cleared the final legal complications at month 9, $27,400,000, minus taxes, minus legal fees, minus the specific adjustment that represented my contribution to the Investor Restitution Fund, a decision I made early and that my lawyer described as unusually voluntary and that I described as non-negotiable. What remained was still life-changing. I know that. I'm not going to pretend otherwise or construct a narrative in which money doesn't matter, because it does, and pretending it doesn't is its own kind of dishonesty. But here's what I did with it and why, and what I think it means. I bought a building in Tacoma, 3 blocks from the apartment building where my mother and I had lived for most of my childhood, a former community services building that had been closed for 6 years when its municipal funding was cut, which is its own small story about what cities decide matters and what they decide doesn't. It took 14 months to renovate. It was not a smooth process. There were contractors who didn't show up and permits that took longer than they should have, and a structural issue on the second floor that cost significantly more to fix than the initial estimate had suggested, because that is the nature of old buildings, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. I learned to be patient with it, or I learned to try to be patient with it, which is different and more honest. The building opened on a Thursday morning in late April, 16 months after a Tuesday in October when I had burned my toast and driven toward a law office and stopped at a red light. I named it the Claire Mercer Resource Center. I didn't make a speech at the opening. I had thought about it and decided that the building was the speech. What it was, what it would do, who it was for. Sometimes the work is the statement. Sometimes you don't need to stand at a podium and explain it. What it does? Emergency housing assistance, job training, legal aid clinics staffed by volunteer attorneys, financial literacy workshops, a dedicated program for people experiencing homelessness that treats them as people with histories and futures rather than problems to be processed. It does these things because they are the things my mother would have needed at various points in her life if there had been somewhere to go with them. It does these things because Elias Voss spent 20 years without any of them and kept going anyway, and I didn't want anyone else to have to make that calculation. Elias became the founding director. This was his idea as much as mine. Actually, in the earliest planning conversations, it was more his idea than mine. He had spent 6 months, while the legal proceedings moved forward, quietly mapping what the building should be, what gaps it should fill, what the people who walk through its doors would actually need versus what they would be assumed to need. He brought this mapping to me in a folder, handwritten, organized with the thoroughness of a man who had spent 20 years paying attention to the gap between institutional intention and human reality. I read it and said, "You should run it." He said, "I was going to suggest that." There are things about Elias Voss running a resource center that are not simple. He is not a warm presence, in the conventional sense. He does not greet people with the performed compassion that some social service environments lean on, the practiced empathy that reads to people who have seen the underside of institutions as management rather than care. What he offers instead is something that I think is rarer and more useful. He is completely without illusion about how hard things are, and completely without condescension about the people who find them hard, and he shows up the same way every day, which is the thing that people who have had everything unreliable in their lives need more than warmth. He was, of course, not yet officially credentialed when the center opened. The expungement proceedings were still in process. He held the title of founding director on the basis of his 20 years of documented community service, which Tran helped formalize in a way that was creative but procedurally sound. The credentials came through at month 18. I was in the center when Elias got the notification. We were in the middle of a mundane planning meeting about a facility issue with the second-floor plumbing, which had developed a complaint, and his phone buzzed, and he looked at it, and he went very still in the specific way that meant something large was happening underneath. He showed me the screen. Professional certification status? Restored. All prior disciplinary actions expunged from official record. I looked at it. I looked at him. He put the phone face down on the table and said, "So, the plumbing." I said, "Elias." He said, "The plumbing is the more urgent issue." "Elias?" He looked up. His eyes were dry. He was managing them carefully, and the managing was visible, which was its own kind of honesty from a man who had spent 20 years keeping everything contained. 20 years, I said. 18, he said, roughly. "That's your quibble? The count?" Something cracked very slightly in the managed surface. "I spent 18 years, he said, believing that the most I could hope for was to get the evidence to the right person before I died. That was the whole project." He looked at the phone. I genuinely did not allow myself to plan further than that. It felt... He stopped. It felt like buying a ticket to a destination and imagining what you do when you arrived there. It felt like a risk I couldn't afford. "And now you're there," I said. He sat with that. "I don't know what to do with normal," he said. Same thing he'd said in the coffee shop 16 months ago. "You're learning," I said. Same thing I'd said back. He looked at me. "You sound like her," he said. I didn't say anything. "That's not a criticism," he said. "It's..." He stopped. "She would have been..." He stopped again. He didn't finish the sentence. Neither of us needed him to. "There is a photograph in my apartment now. I had it made from the original. The 1993 company lobby photograph. My mother at 25. Elias beside her. Her natural smile. His half-raised arm. The original went into the evidentiary record and will stay there. But Thomas Bray, before he returned to Spokane, had arranged for a high-quality digital reproduction. It sits on the shelf in my living room in the apartment I repainted, finally, 4 months after the center opened. The wall color is a warm gray that I chose because my mother once described a color she wanted for a kitchen she never got to have. And it was this gray. I look at the photograph sometimes in the evening when the day is done. My mother looking slightly away from the camera, caught mid-thought, more real than posed. A 25-year-old woman who had no idea what was coming and who was, in that moment, just a person at a work event standing next to a friend. I think about what she knew, what she chose to carry alone, why she made the choices she made. I think I understand most of it now. I understand the logic of the protection she constructed around me, the manufactured absence of family history, the sealed-off past, the story she gave me that had no dangerous roots. She was trying to give me a life that the company couldn't reach, a life built on something clean. What she couldn't have known was that I'd find out anyway, that the truth has a weight that doesn't diminish with time. It just waits. That you can build walls around it, and the walls hold, and then one day a man at a red light says a name only the dead should know, and the walls come down, and everything that was stored behind them is still there, still true, still demanding to be dealt with. Here is what I believe, having lived through this. You cannot protect the people you love by lying to them about what they come from. You can delay the reckoning. You can manage the timing, but the truth finds its level eventually, the way water does, and the longer it's been held back, the harder it hits when it arrives. My mother thought she was keeping me safe by keeping me ignorant. She was, in one real sense, I grew up without the weight of it, without the fear, without the target on my back. That was real. That was a gift. But I also grew up not knowing that the woman who raised me was one of the bravest people I would ever encounter. Not knowing that she had walked into a room full of powerful people with evidence of their crimes and refused to be managed. Not knowing that the stubborn, quiet determination I always thought was just her personality was, in fact, something she had earned and tested and paid for. I would have wanted to know that. I would have been proud to know that. So if you're reading this or listening to this and you're carrying something alone because you think the people who love you can't handle it, I want to offer you the other possibility, that the people who love you are stronger than you believe, that the truth, even the hard truth, is something people can be given and can hold. That protection built on secrecy has a cost that comes due eventually, and honesty, even late, even imperfect, gives people the chance to actually stand beside you rather than watching from a distance, in the dark, unable to help. My mother carried everything alone. I'm not angry at her for it. I understand why. But I wish she hadn't. I wish she could have let someone stand beside her. The rain came back that Thursday morning, the day the center opened. Of course it did. This is Seattle, and October, and the weather here is loyal to its own logic, regardless of what's happening to the humans underneath it. I stood at the door of the Claire Mercer Resource Center and watched people come in. Not dramatically, not in a flood of immediate and obvious need, the way you might picture it. Just people. One at a time or in pairs, checking the address against something on their phones or written on a piece of paper, looking up at the building with the expression of people approaching something they've been told might help and are reserving judgment on. A man in his 50s with a worn duffel bag who talked to the intake coordinator for 40 minutes and then sat in the waiting area drinking coffee with the particular stillness of someone who has been outside for a long time and has not quite adjusted to being inside. Two women, maybe mother and daughter, looking at the job training program information on the wall with the focused attention of people doing math in their heads. A younger man, 20s, who came in and immediately looked like he wanted to leave, and who the intake coordinator, a woman Elias had hired specifically because she had the patience of someone who had once needed exactly this kind of patience applied to her, talked to in a low, unhurried voice until something in his posture changed. Elias moved through the space with the particular efficiency of someone who had been planning this layout in his head for 16 months. Not hovering, not managing, just present, available, attentive, the gravitational steadiness of someone who knows exactly where things are and why they're where they are. At some point in the morning, he came and stood beside me at the door. We watched two people cross the street toward the building, checking the address, looking up. "She would have stood at this window," I said. "Yes," he said, checking to see if the people coming in looked like they needed, and then she'd have gone out to meet them before they got to the door, he said. She never waited for people to come all the way to her if she could see they were already tired. I thought about that. I thought about a woman I never got to know fully, a woman who died before I understood what I was looking at, who had managed to pour everything she was into raising me and fighting an impossible fight and protecting everyone around her until she had nothing left to protect herself with. I thought about what it costs to be that kind of person in a world that is not organized around that kind of person. And I thought about the building I was standing in, which would not erase any of it, would not bring her back or undo what was done or rewrite the story she lived, but which would do something real and specific and named after her. The work is the work, she used to say. You do it because it's there. I looked out at the street, at the two people crossing toward us, at the weak October light doing its best. "Come on," I said to Elias, and we walked out to meet them.